So what do you? Good afternoon, everybody. If you could take your seats, we're gonna get started. So good afternoon. Thanks everybody for attending our AAE Annual Forum for 2024. The leadership team met before this meeting, and we were discussing exactly how many years we've been as a group been meeting, and it's somewhere around, what'd we say, Ernie, about 12 years that there's been a forum of this group of ag, auto, and ethanol and other stakeholders to discuss the importance of low carbon fuels and future fuels. So the AAE organizing committee has put together a great agenda, and today we're going to be starting with unpacking some of the transportation rules that have been proposed, others that have recently been finalized. And first up today, we have Mike Hartrick from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. He's been with the automotive innovators since the inception, and he came over from the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, which he joined in 2016. He also covers topics such as greenhouse gas, fuel economy regulations, and vehicle certification issues. He brings over 20 years of automotive industry experience to auto innovators, including 16 plus years at FCA and its predecessors. So let's welcome Mike Hartrick.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, everybody. I get the short straw, I guess, speaking right after lunch, is it, about automotive regulations. So I'll try not to make it too dry here. It's been quite the year since we last met last May. We've had a lot of the things that I was talking about last year were all just proposals. A lot of it, I think, was just recently out the door, if I remember correctly. We had an EPA proposal in hand, and we had a Department of Energy proposal about electric vehicle fuel economy in hand, but we didn't even have a CAFE proposal yet in hand. So we were talking about a lot of what ifs and a lot of looking at the regulations from the perspective of not yet final, but things that were greatly concerning to us at the time. So today we'll talk a little bit about where the final rules are and what's still out there on the horizon that isn't final yet. And let me see if I get this working here. So a little bit about regulatory policies today. So when I hear you snoring, I'll know I'm done. Okay, so I wanted to first talk about set the landscape of regulatory policy here, because even in my relatively narrow area of energy and environmental regulations, there is a whole lot going on. We are regulated at about 4 different agencies. I think it's 7 to 8 different regulations, depending on how you count them. And some of these things are already final, like as I was alluding to. Some of these things are pending and soon to come out, and other things are still under development. So in terms of things that were recently finalized or have been final for maybe a year or two now, it's these first 3 items at the top on the final rules here. Let's see if my pointer even works. Oh, look at that. Okay. So there's a EPA multi-pollutant rule, they called it, and it really covered 3 different pieces, I think all of which are a concern to this group here today. First being criteria emissions, the traditional pollutants like we think about coming out of the tailpipe. Second being greenhouse gas emissions for both light duty and medium duty vehicles and some of the heavy duty vehicles. I am not going to touch on medium and heavy duty today. I'm more of a light duty centric expert, and I'll let others take on heavy duty issues as we go today. The final piece of that rule actually dates back to 2020 when EPA was proposing how to move from the use of E0 fuel to the E10 fuel that they are now using for testing. And even today, we are still running tests on a mixture of those 2 fuels, and I'll touch on that a little bit here as we go along. I also mentioned that the Department of Energy had a petroleum equivalency factor, or PEF, so I'll probably use that acronym. It's But that's about EV fuel economy. How much miles per gallon does a vehicle that doesn't even burn fuel actually get? And then finally, at the bottom here is a rule that's been final for a while, and that's the CARB, Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which has both criteria pollutants in it and their ZEV mandate, but not a greenhouse gas regulation. In terms of other things that we expect to come out pretty quickly are the NHTSA corporate average fuel economy rule and the CARB ZEV and LEV4 waiver, which allows them to actually enforce these rules they've already adopted. Then moving finally to the right-hand column here, there's a couple rules still under development, and I would say they're under fairly early development still, so I can't say a whole lot about them, but I'll direct you towards CARB if you want to learn more about them. And that first is their greenhouse gas emissions rule. So they are actively looking at EPA's greenhouse gas rule and trying to decide, how do we implement a greenhouse gas rule in California? So this would be an extension of what currently goes through 2026. And they are probably looking at a rule that will cover probably the 2028 model year, maybe 2029 model year through 2035, when California otherwise has a 100% electric vehicle mandate. And also related to that, they're also looking at amendments to what has already been finalized in the ACC2 program, not to change the stringency of that program so much as to clarify certain aspects of it and tweak a few things around. And they're also openly, again, looking at what EPA did in its rule and seeing, okay, are there places that we should be aligning with EPA? And even frankly, we're looking at EPA and saying, are there places that you should still be aligning with California, but you didn't? So a lot of things still on the table, a lot of things that are all related to each other. And it's really hard to come to final conclusions without seeing all of these rules together. So I'll hold off on final conclusions here for another day. Let's touch on the EPA light duty greenhouse gas rule. First of all, let me start here. This is extremely challenging from an automaker perspective. You know, we felt that there was significant change between the proposal and the final rule, but ultimately the final rule still gets to the same place the proposal did, which is in EPA's new assessment about 85 grams per mile. I just did the math while we were sitting here and Michael was introducing me, and that's the equivalent of 105 miles per gallon if we were to assume roughly the carbon content of gasoline. So this is no laughing matter. This is going to largely drive electrification, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. But in any case, it is less front-loaded, which provides a little bit more running room for auto manufacturers in terms of technology approaches, especially in the nearer term. It does have more credits than the original proposal, but fewer credits than the rules as they stand today. I would broadly characterize flexibilities as being eliminated for electric vehicles. And then every other vehicle still has some of the flexibilities that they had today. So I'm talking primarily about air conditioning and off-cycle technologies, if you're familiar with those. And if not, and you need to know more, I'm happy to answer later. So still a little bit less stringent, but still higher electrification and plug-in hybrids. So down at the bottom here, dash line being the proposal where EPA estimated battery electric vehicles only as part of its technology compliance path, getting to about 68% electric vehicles in 2032 and roughly 60% in 2030. With the new assessments and different standards that were finalized versus the proposal, those numbers are dropped a little bit, but we're still talking about major change from where we are today. So by 2030, the number is about 53% electric vehicles, including plug-in hybrids now. And EPA's estimates for 2032 actually exceed the original proposal. If I do the math right, that's about 69% versus the 67 or 68% they were looking at in the proposal. So fewer pure electric vehicles, but we in the auto industry generally consider plug-in hybrids as part of the electric vehicle fleet too. So a little bit more even than that, because plug-in hybrids obviously have greenhouse gas emissions more than battery electric vehicles do. Wanted to touch at least on the prevalence of internal combustion engine vehicles. So EPA's projections here, to the degree you want to go along with them or believe those, say there's going to be a pretty drastic reduction in the number of internal combustion engine vehicles sold in this time period from even starting today in 24. EPA is essentially saying the peak of things that can include internal combustion engine vehicles is going to happen roughly next model year. And then from there on out, they expect fewer and fewer vehicles to have internal combustion engines and declining over time. But that's still a whole lot of internal combustion engine vehicles to be built in the future. So maybe a good news story that there's a lot of internal combustion engine vehicles still being built if you're looking at this from a liquid fuels perspective. Bad news story that the overall volume is definitely decreasing. I don't have a slide in here today, but of course the car park would show similar trends, but the car park has millions and hundreds of millions of vehicles in it. But as more and more electric vehicles are built and substitute in for those internal combustion engine vehicles, the total amount of liquid fueled vehicles in the car park is also likely to decline. So I wanted to touch briefly on, is this an electric vehicle mandate? Technically, no. EPA would tell you this is a technology neutral program, but an 85 gram per mile standard, essentially, if we were to take the fleet average emissions for different types of technologies, and these are EPA projections for 2032, if I remember correctly. What you see here is you go to the left or in red or orange, maybe if that's the color here that we can see on the screen here. That's essentially negative to the standard or worse than standard. Green I've plotted as better than standard. So an internal combustion engine vehicle is going to be far below where, or far worse than it needs to be to actually meet these standards. They can be balanced out by the electric vehicles to some extent, but there's still a lot of challenges here. Even a strong hybrid, if manufacturers were going to go down that pathway, less negative, so less balancing needed, but you still need to get to electrification to actually balance out compliance even within EPA's own projections. So plug-in hybrids, we'll call them roughly equal to the final standards. Battery electric vehicles significantly better than the final standards, given that they are counted without upstream emissions, 0 grams per mile. And the fleet overall, I think the last takeaway maybe here is the fleet overall is EPA is projecting that cars are probably going to be a little bit on the positive side and trucks probably a little bit on the negative. And there's some flexibilities that would allow credits to move between those two fleets. So maybe a little bit more challenging for trucks, and that's certainly not a surprise. I don't have a particular slide on it today, but EPA's moving the truck fleet standards much closer to the car fleet than they have historically been. So let me talk a little bit about the E10 test fuel transition. So today we're already testing for criteria emissions, non-methane organic gases, hydrocarbons, if you will, NOx, the nitrous oxides, and oxides of nitrogen, I should say, carbon monoxide, things like that on E10 fuel. So that's been going on for a while now as part of the Tier 3 program. EPA has now adopted a Tier 4 program, and that continues on with E10. No real fuel changes in the certification fuel for criteria emissions. But what has been E0 for a long time has been greenhouse gas testing and fuel economy testing. And what EPA said is, okay, finally we figured out the way we want to do the transition. Until 2027, you can keep using E0. That provides a little bit, there's a little bit higher greenhouse gas emissions with E0, a little bit lower fuel economy with E0. Starting in 2027, we start transitioning to E10. We can carry over E0 test results so we don't have to retest vehicles. But any new tests have to come on the E10 fuel. And by 2030, everything needs to be tested on E10 fuel for greenhouse gas emissions and fuel economy. Big concern here, I think we've talked in the past that one of the things we were really hoping for in this transition rule was that EPA would not make a policy that would punish lower carbon liquid fuels. To some extent, that was accomplished. There's no penalty for going to E10 when we hit the 2027 and later timeframe. But if we were to transition to E10 early as automakers before 2027, EPA has set an adjustment where they're going to artificially increase the carbon dioxide emissions on that fuel under the reasoning that, okay, we set greenhouse gas emissions based on the presumption of E0, and E10 will give you some benefit that we don't want you to get. Not a great policy outcome in our minds, but from a compliance perspective, this is something we can live with, at least as the auto industry. I won't touch very deeply into the criteria emission space. This is a bit less related to ethanol in my mind. But I did want to at least say that the standards that we're talking about in Tier 4 are much more stringent than they previously were. We're talking about essentially cutting the NMOG plus NOx levels in half from where they are today. That's going to largely also potentially drive electric vehicles in order to meet those sorts of levels. If you assume that the fleet in general is probably going to average about 30 milligrams per mile from the internal combustion engine vehicles, you need zeros in there to get down to 15. Particulate matter standards are much more stringent, requiring gasoline particulate filters. And there's a number of other aspects of Tier 4 that make it in general much more stringent than the Tier 3 program. So let me talk a little bit about electric vehicle fuel economy. Again, electric vehicles don't burn petroleum, but we count them as having miles per gallon. So what's going on here, and I know other speakers will expand on this, so I won't dwell on it too deeply, is that today an electric vehicle probably averages about 300 to 400 miles per gallon. They go up in fuel economy in terms of fleet performance when we start considering other credits like air conditioning and off-cycle technologies. But the vehicle itself is counted at roughly 400 miles per gallon. What DOE finalized in their rule is essentially a phase out of part of the equation that determines that fuel economy, essentially taking that fuel economy and for some of the better battery electric vehicles probably landing in probably the 150 mile per gallon space, maybe as low as 80 or 90 miles per gallon for some of the lower or less efficient battery electric vehicles. NHTSA CAFE standards, of course, are not final yet, but we're projected to reach about 58 miles per gallon. Why the big difference from the EPA rule? A lot of that's in the treatment of electric vehicles. So if the EPA rule says electric vehicles are 0 grams per mile, that's essentially an infinite fuel economy value. And of course, if we have a real fuel economy value that we're counting for electric vehicles, then that's a lesser fuel economy level you can meet. And fuel economy is not linear. So when you're talking about fuel economies in the 60 mile per gallon range, even small changes in the treatment of electric vehicles, regardless of the total number of those vehicles, can make really big differences in achievable fuel economy levels. I'll just close on CAFE that NHTSA is not really supposed to be looking at electric vehicles at all, but kind of expect that they will in the final rule as they did in the proposal. ZEV mandate is probably a little bit more familiar. Nothing has really changed in this space, but this is the rule that California is requiring 100% electric vehicles, 20% of which could be plug-in hybrids. I think what's really interesting here as we've gone over the past year or two is not necessarily that California is looking for 100% electric vehicles. That's shocking and was shocking maybe 2 years ago, but it's really not a surprise in terms of their policy priorities. I think what's been interesting over the past couple of years is states such as Colorado and let me see, New Mexico, I think it is, that haven't adopted the full mandate. So in the past, states would adopt whatever California did. These states are looking at this now and saying, we're not sure we're going to be able to get to 100% electric vehicles or that we want to. So I think that's interesting is some states have stopped at 2032. The other interesting outcome to me is that there were a couple of states that have historically required the ZEV mandate, and their legislatures and their regulators, depending on the state, have essentially pushed back and decided not to adopt these regulations. So that would be Connecticut and Maine. It's not everybody is on the bandwagon for 100% electric vehicles. So let me close today and talk a little bit about EV market trends. I'll leave it up to you and maybe to Alexander tomorrow to talk about why these are happening, and I'll just touch on where things are standing right now. And this is not the negative story I think maybe you thought I would say as I started my little exposition here. I do want to note that it's not so much what we're hearing in the news is everything's bad in the electric vehicle market, and that's not necessarily true. The electric vehicle market really is still growing. It's just not growing at the same pace that it was. So if you look at the left, this is electric vehicle sales. We see year over year continued increases in sales. On the right is EV market share. We see year over year increases in EV market share. But I think what we're seeing though is a more linear growth rate than the exponential growth rate that a lot of regulators are hoping for. So I think that's kind of important to think about in terms of how are we going to get to some of the standards we need. And here is our 2023's electric vehicle sales rate versus the targets in 2030. And California's doing pretty well. That's about 1 in 4 one electric vehicle for every 4 vehicles sold already. But if you look at the rest of the states that have adopted the ZEV mandate, they're in the 5 to 20% range, averaging out right around 12 to 13%, if I remember correctly. And the US itself is at roughly 10%. So the auto industry has a long way to go if we're going to meet these regulatory targets, even in the 2030 timeframe, let alone the 100% electric vehicle target. Transaction prices for electric vehicles have been dropping, not because the technology is getting better, not because batteries are getting cheaper, although some of the really high prices for lithium and some of the other chemicals that go into batteries have moderated somewhat. But this price drop is more about trying to reinforce volume. Most of this is driven by Tesla. Tesla is losing sales and market share right now, so they continue to drop prices on their vehicles, and that's what we're seeing here in this graph, I think. In comparison to 2023, though, and this is where I think a lot of the news stories are coming from, and a lot of why manufacturers are looking at hybrids more strongly. So we see a lot of manufacturers talking about hybrid electric vehicles. We see a lot of manufacturers talking about bringing plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And these are the sort of trends that they're looking at. Yes, ICE vehicles are still going down in market share. Plug-in hybrids are up a bit. Hybrid electric vehicles so far in 2024 versus 2023 are up significantly. And fuel cells, that's kind of a meaningless piece. That's a couple hundred vehicles a year. Electric vehicles, though, are down. Is that some of the trend that we're looking at? So that's what I have for today. Happy to take questions after the other speakers, I think. Is that how you want to handle it, Michael? Great. So hopefully that's a good introduction for everybody of where we stand with light duty regulations today.
Thanks, Mike. And next, I'd like to introduce Jimmy Conde, is counsel at Boyd and Gray, specializing in energy, environmental, and administrative law with particular expertise in the Clean Air Act. He has protected clients against agency overreach in numerous cutting-edge and complex legal proceedings. His written commentary has been published and referenced in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Examiner, and other very important publications. So thank you.
Is there a remote? Oh. Is there a slide deck coming? Jimmy Condon? Ooh. All right, well, no slides for you. I do have to ask Mike if we can use your slide 6 in litigation. We'll put it in our briefs. Just kidding. So
You could recreate them if you need to.
Mike talked about the light duty rules, so I'm gonna touch on or just overview the heavy duty rules, and just give you a sort of a holistic picture of everything that's going on. So the way that I like to think about the sort of whole of government approach that the Biden administration is using to mandate electrification throughout the whole fleet is that it's really a series of building blocks. So it starts with the states, right? So it starts with California and states in the West and East Coast following along. Then there's tax credits, subsidies coming from Congress. Then there's the EPA using those state standards as a baseline, those tax subsidies as a baseline to essentially build on that and further accelerate electric vehicles. And then NHTSA's role is a bit strange nowadays, but it's sort of serving as a sort of insurance policy for EPA in a way. But the heavy duty rules are a bit different because there's no need to sort of align the programs here because they can both, NHTSA can assume that heavy duty vehicles emit zero emissions, or at least it has been assuming that. And the statute does not clearly require them to take into account upstream emissions, unlike for the automobile regulations, the light duty regulations. So that's been a little more seamless of a transition in terms of trying to achieve harmonization. But again, that also starts with California. We have the Advanced Clean Trucks rule that we've mentioned. That was granted a waiver this last spring, I want to say. Then building on top of that, we have the greenhouse gas heavy duty standards that EPA has just recently promulgated. Those have already been challenged in court. Those regulations really vary by vehicle class. So for some classes of heavy duty vehicles, the EPA rules will push approximately 60% electrification. For other classes like tractor cabs, it's going to be less than that. Again, just like for light duty vehicles, the standards for that EPA has promulgated for trucks cannot be met through the use of compression ignition engines using diesel. You're going to have to rely on some combination of battery electric vehicles, fuel cells, if that's ever going to happen, or EPA mentions the possibility of hydrogen internal combustion engines. EPA says that, of course, you don't need to use electric vehicles to comply, and it has an alternative scenario where everybody figures out hydrogen internal combustion engines that California prohibits because they emit NOx, and they hybridize all other vehicles, and then you can comply with the rules. So they're pretty aggressive rules, and it's a different, I want to say it's a different level of aggressive than the light duty vehicle rules, because even though they are pushing just an astonishing penetration of light duty electric vehicles, for heavy duty vehicles, especially on the heavy side, tractors, it's really an untested market. And there's really, I mean, just a couple of years ago, there were no electric heavy duty trucks, and they're pushing them up to, according to EPA, 40% for day cab tractors by 2032, 25% for sleeper cab tractors. That's their main projection for ZEVs under the rules. So that's an extremely aggressive penetration for something that's never been tested. And of course, I think we're going to see that those tractors are going to be sold in states that have adopted the California rules. So it's going to be really an experiment run mostly on the West and the East Coast. The problem with that is that most of our ports are in the East or West Coast. So most trucks that go in and out of coastal ports are going to have to electrify, which is going to be a pretty significant problem for the movement of goods across the country. So then let me talk about Advanced Clean Trucks a little bit. Advanced Clean Trucks is just like ACC2. It's a sales mandate pushing a certain percentage of ZEV trucks through up to 2035. So it really depends on the class of vehicle. You have the lightest classes 2B and 3, goes up to 55% by 2035. Oh, great. Let's see. So there you go. Much better, right? So you go up to, for classes 4 and 8, you're going to go up to 75% ZEVs by 2035, which is very aggressive. And then for tractors, you're going to have to go up to 40% to comply with ACT. One of the astonishing things about ACT is, I think Michael might talk about this, or somebody else might mention it later, that basically all truck manufacturers have already agreed to comply with this. So they've entered into an agreement with CARB saying, regardless of whether this is struck down in court, we're going to follow this schedule and try to meet these targets. So this is already being litigated in the DC Circuit. That case has been stayed pending the other cases that are pending in the DC Circuit. So it's going to take a while for all that to get resolved. This is what ACT looks like in practice. So it has been adopted in 10 states, mostly on the West and East Coast, but you also have New Mexico and Colorado in there. So the states that have adopted it account for 25% of heavy-duty vehicle registrations. I stole this chart from CARB. They account for 25% of revenues. And so what do the manufacturers get in exchange for the agreement? CARB has said that in exchange, it's gonna align its rules mostly, but not quite, with EPA's extremely aggressive heavy-duty NOx rule that they just recently promulgated. And it may or may not allow credit pooling, depending on what environmental justice advocates think in California. So they're currently, I think, in the process of trying to figure out some credit pooling program among the West Coast and East Coast states for ACT. The point being that manufacturers, if they have to comply with rules in, say, Oregon or Maryland, it's going to be far more challenging because there's absolutely zero infrastructure in those states. So the next, we have an even more aggressive rule that is called Advanced Clean Fleets. So this rule has 4 main components, and it's really the way to think about this rule. It's a demand mandate, it's a purchase mandate, essentially requiring fleets of different types to purchase electric vehicles. So you can see now why the manufacturers have agreed to follow along ACT, is because now they have a captive market under this rule. So what this rule does is it has 4 components. So one applies to manufacturers, and that part of the rule says that they have to achieve 100% new heavy-duty vehicle ZEVs by 2036. So manufacturers have already agreed also to comply with that mandate. So they've agreed to phase out diesel engines in California, at least by 2036. We'll see if that happens. Then the next rule is a big part of the program is called the High Priority Fleet Rule, which applies to certain fleets of, I think the rules are you have to have more than 50 trucks or more than 50 million in gross revenues anywhere in the world. And as long as you send a single truck into California for a day, you could be on the hook to electrify that truck. So essentially all big fleets that come in and out outside of California now have to electrify. That's extremely challenging. And also it is going to have a very broad reach outside California, because I think California accounts for about 70% of imports by volume in the United States. So a lot of trucks are coming in and out of the ports of Long Beach and LA and carrying goods out of California. So that's going to have a broad reach throughout the country. Then there are specific rules that apply to so-called drayage trucks that work in freight rails and ports. So that's also very aggressive. Then there's a less significant rule for state and local governments, which interestingly, the high priority fleet rule portion of it applies to some federal fleets, and that is more aggressive than the rules that apply to California local governments. So that's quite an interesting thing to say. So this is what the high priority fleet rule looks like. So the fleet owners that are subject to that rule must retire internal combustion vehicles after they exceed 800,000 miles, or when the engine model year is 18 years or older, whatever happens first. So essentially this is a forced retirement rule, right? So because there's this concern that if you're forcing manufacturers to sell electric trucks that nobody wants, that people are going to keep their old internal combustion trucks for longer. So they've decided to just make that illegal. So you have to sell your existing internal combustion trucks. And then the next option, and as of course, once you sell your old internal combustion trucks, you have to replace those with ZEVs. So the next option is you can meet these milestones that they have in here. And so you can see what that looks like. For certain types of vehicles, you're going to have to phase out your internal combustion engines. And this applies not to just new vehicles, by the way. This is for fleets. So it applies to existing vehicles. You have to replace all of your existing vehicles by 2035 in the group 1, by 2039 in group 2, and all your sleeper cab tractors and specialty vehicles by 2042. By then, everything has to be a ZEV for these fleets. So I think, as I mentioned, this is going to be an enormous challenge for a lot of reasons that don't necessarily apply to the light duty sector. So it's electrifying trucks is a completely different ball game, right? So you have, you're not just commuting to work. You have to carry a lot of goods. You have to go long distances, and there's a lot of challenges related to that. So we'll see how that shakes out in California. So now I'm going to move on to light duty vehicles again, just to touch on some of the things that Mike was talking about, and regulatory alignment. So this is Justice Stevens right here. He's the justice who wrote the decision in Massachusetts versus EPA. So in that decision, as you can read from this quote, EPA was arguing, you can't make us regulate carbon dioxide emissions from light duty vehicles, because then our obligations will conflict with NHTSA's obligations. It will be a whole mess. We won't be able to reconcile these two, because NHTSA's statute is very specific and prescriptive. It has a lot of things that they can and cannot do, whereas EPA has this broad open-ended grant of authority that is subject to almost no constraints. And so Justice Stevens sort of brushed it off in a single paragraph, and he has this bolded quote sort of saying, figure it out, right? So that worked out for maybe about 10 years, sort of, kind of, not really, but they were able to make it work for a while they were still just regulating gasoline vehicles for the most part. But I think what we've seen as electric vehicles have started to penetrate is we've seen that these statutes don't really make sense together. So what you have on the one hand is California ACC 2, which says ZEVs are the only option. Then on the other side, similar to California, but not quite, you have standards the gas cars cannot meet. EVs are assumed to emit 0 emissions, and you have, as a result, an enormous compliance bias in favor of electric vehicles. NHTSA, on the other hand, you have a statute that says gas cars have to be able to meet the standards, right? You cannot consider electric vehicles when setting the standards. So you set the standards essentially for gas cars. EVs are meant to be a flexibility, not something that you're supposed to be mandated to make. And so the way that the agencies have tried to make this work together, even though you really can't make sense of it together, is the Department of Energy has used very high, I would say, inflated values for the fuel economy of electric vehicles to try to make sense of it. And so just to break that down a little more, we have a very complicated statute in CAFE, right? So you have 3 agencies. You have NHTSA, you have EPA, and you have the Department of Energy. So basically how this works is NHTSA sets the standards, EPA sort of does the math. They calculate the fuel economy of cars and then send a report to NHTSA. And then the Department of Energy has a minor role where supposedly minor role, where it calculates the equivalent miles per gallon of electric vehicles, essentially. And that feeds into EPA's calculations of compliance. So this is what the statute, the text of the law looks like. So you can see here that DOE has to consider 4 factors, right? So the first and second are you look at the efficiency of the vehicles, you look at the efficiency of electricity compared to gasoline, then you look at, this is the broader one that DOE tries to use, the need of the United States to conserve energy and the scarcity value of all fuel. And then you look at how often electric vehicles are driven compared to gas cars. That's what DOE is supposed to consider. So what DOE has done instead is, sorry for the math here, we can skip over that. But essentially they've said, we're gonna not just consider the fuel efficiency, the vehicle efficiency, and we're also gonna just multiply electric vehicle efficiency by essentially 6.67. We can talk about where that comes from, but suffice it to say that DOE has said there's no statutory basis for that. So that was a strange move then, and it's still strange now. But essentially what this does is vastly inflate the efficiency of electric cars. So you can see what that looks like here in practice. I looked through NHTSA's website, and this is what I found. So you have Tesla's model year 2019 domestic passenger car requirement. The standard for them is 39.4 miles. Their actual compliance is 754 miles per gallon. I don't know how they achieve that, but that's an incredible number. And as you can see, the effect of this essentially in practice is that it prioritizes investment in electric vehicles over alternative technologies like hybrids. So you have, you can either produce the Kia Niro BEV that has 390.6 miles per gallon, or the hybrid that has 71. I think it's an obvious choice if you're running against tightening standards like automakers have been over the past few years. So this is what DOE did in the final rule. It proposed eliminating this fuel content factor that multiplied efficiency by 6.67. Saying it has no basis and lacks legal support. It produced to reduce this value by, as Mike mentioned, 72%, which would have meant in practice that the rules wouldn't be aligned with EPA's rules because they wouldn't be overcrediting electric vehicles. So I think the Alliance pointed out that this would significantly reduce their compliance values and cause them significant problems. And in response to these comments, DOE essentially switched to a different rule. And you can see that the difference between the final and the proposed rule there, they're phasing down the difference in values there is they're gradually phasing out the petroleum equivalency, the fuel content factor that we're using before. And they also used sort of different modeling to get to a higher number in the end anyway. So this is what it looks like going forward. So not surprising, somebody has sued DOE over this. And so, but what's the alternative here? So I understand that automakers are placed in an impossible situation by Massachusetts versus EPA. They have no option. They need clarity. They need certainty. They need to be able to comply with a single sort of national program to the best of our ability. So there's a different option also that could also be considered, which is something that has been argued in some of the litigation, which is you can remove electric vehicles from the class of emitting vehicles under the Clean Air Act, and then you can return to joint rulemaking between NHTSA and EPA, and you can use real petroleum equivalency values as a flexibility for NHTSA, but you can still align the programs if you can just take out electric vehicles out of the Clean Air Act program. Sorry, I'm supposed to skip over the slide right here. So you can see there's a different solution. Of course, you also need to sue California, but that's a different matter entirely. But at the national level, I think we can achieve harmonization not by using inflated values for electric vehicles, but through a fuel neutral solution that essentially tries to harmonize NHTSA and EPA by removing electric vehicles. That's still a benefit for electric vehicles, right? So they don't have to comply with any standards. But at the same time, you drive investment in different solutions, not just EVs. So that's where I wanted to end.
Thank you, Jimmy. And next up, we have Chris Hilardes from Flint Hill Resources. And if you're not familiar with Flint Hill Resources, Flint Hills Resources is a leading refining company with operations primarily in the Midwest and Texas. Flint Hill Resources produces essential products that power and improve people's lives through reliable transportation fuels that keep us moving and chemical building blocks that help to make modern life possible. So Chip?
So thanks. Yeah, Chip Hillardis with Flint Hills. I oversee quality and stewardship for Flint Hills. And if you don't know, Flint Hills is part of Koch Industries. I didn't bring any slides today. I just wanted to make a few comments. Actually, I think Ernie railroaded me into doing this, making sure we had a refinery perspective. But I do have some thoughts I just want to reflect on. From a refinery, we try to bring a very sober point of view to what's happening, and especially if you know anything about Koch Industries, we're very diligent about how we think about things. And Charles is makes us really question our assumptions and what we're doing. So we spent a lot of time getting a point of view around liquid transportation fuels and EVs and what do we think's happening. And obviously these regulations are very aspirational, and I have a few comments in there that might say that it's may not be achievable. I think our perspective would be, even if we all agreed this was a very good idea and we want to get as much capital as we could to go after it, would still be a very difficult undertaking. And so as we look at the scenarios out there, we actually see a fairly long runway for liquid transportation fuels, and especially distillate diesel will be the hardest to do. And a lot of what that comes down to are a number of factors. One is these new technologies rely on new minerals, new metals, supply chains that are global. And there's a lot of risk in those. And the other thing is electrification of everything will create headwinds for that as well. I was actually at a AI conference, C3.ai, in March, and listened to a board member from NVIDIA who's also on C3's board talk about NVIDIA is going to produce 3.5 million GPUs this year at about 700 watts each. And so if you do the math, it's about 2.5 gigawatts of continuous electricity you need just to power NVIDIA's GPUs that are coming out. And if you look across all the things we're trying to electrify, and we're going to shut down coal plants. We're really not reinvesting in nuclear, although we're talking about it. And we're going to decarbonize our electric grid. There's massive headwinds in all of those endeavors as well. And so I think if you look at any of the outlooks, I think Exxon recently updated their industry outlook. And if you look at their fossil fuel projections worldwide, you really don't see a decline out to 2050. Now, obviously, some regions, OECD countries will see more decline in gasoline than in diesel. But all that's to say that these are, very aspirational what EPA has put out there, and we're trying to understand, what are the scenarios and how do we think that'll play out. But we think there's long demand for liquid transportation fuels, and frankly, we're very interested in understanding how, we can partner with ethanol and others to really understand how to get after that and make sure that liquid transportation fuels that we're using free market principles, that, it's technology neutral, and we're doing full life cycle analysis to really understand the impact. If the objective is what it's stated, we think liquid transportation fuels are certainly a good short and interim solution there. So that's one thought. And I think it really is, to us, is going to be an all of the above. I think EVs have penetrated into kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. So urban, affluent. And I think as they get later in their growth, it's going to be more and more difficult for that penetration to occur. Again, all that contributing to more of a lukewarm projection of what's probably going to happen. One of the things I actually sit on the Transportation Energy Institute, formerly the Fuels Institute Advisory Board, and we met last week. So a lot of interesting insights came out of that. But one of the efforts that group, I think, is going to pursue is really around thinking about infrastructure. And so one of the things we talk about is, especially in rural, tribal, low income communities, they're trying to figure out how to invest. You might have an underground storage tank that's about to reach end of life, and they need to make an investment on that. And you're being told EVs are coming, and you're going to invest in EV charging. There's going to be this conflict between what do they do? Do they invest in both? Most of these places can barely afford to make an investment in one of those, let alone both. So I think there'll be some interesting conflicts that play out. But it'll be very difficult for some of those communities to do it. And current administration has a stated policy around EJ and other communities. So it'll be interesting to see how, as those things come to a head, those play out. But again, that feels like a headwind that's going to prevent EVs from maybe getting as much penetration as quickly. Yeah, so I think our point of view is, we need all the above, and this is kind of me just thinking big. I mean, energy, everything we're innovating and doing going forward requires more energy, not less. And as the rest of the world kind of catches up to the developed world, they're going to use a lot more energy. In the US, even if we do have demand destruction for gasoline due to EVs, we'll probably, our exports will continue to grow over time as the rest of the world consumes more. So any of my peer companies, their public statements that I see, yeah, they know that they'll probably have to rationalize refineries over time, but they see a long road for the liquid transportation fuels. And in fact, I think two of the companies went for funding earlier this year, and they had a round of funding. They were oversubscribed on 30 and 40-year instruments. So these are companies like CP, ConocoPhillips, and others. And they didn't get any questions about any of this in that round. So just an anecdote, though, that says, despite, EPA's and the administration's, I guess, final rules that are now out there, we expect there to be obviously a lot of legal challenges. So major questions, doctrine, and many other things that were alluded to, I think will be barriers. All that we can hope for is, like I said, free market principles, technology neutral, full life cycle. And I think liquid transportation fuels will be around for a while. So that's kind of my high level comment. So appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chip. And I think we'll open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, there's a microphone here down up front. If you can come down to the microphone and any questions?
Brian West, retired from Oak Ridge. Michael, you talked about the test fuels, E0 and E10 and the air quality, the CRC air quality AQUART program back in the 90s. I forget how many tests they did, but they wrote a paper and said the R factor should be 0.94. And they did a lot of tests. It was probably unprecedented at its time. The Oak Ridge boys published a report that said our factor should be 0.95 or 0.96. And that was based on about 1,000 emissions tests of 35 cars. EPA set the R factor at 0.81, I think based on 30 tests. Am I right?
Yeah, I don't remember the
How come you're
specific
not
number,
still
but not a
involved
whole
with
lot.
that, Michael?
Hmm.
So
It was a small number of vehicles, maybe 8,
pardon?
small number of vehicles. I don't know how many tests.
I think it was 10 vehicles and probably 3 tests per vehicle.
They threw out 2 of the vehicles.
Anyway, I'm not really I guess it's kind of a comment, kind of a question. They set the R factor at 0.81. Do you want to comment on that? I mean, it really should be 1. They should have set it in 2013. I just want to complain.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Yes, we agree with you. It should have been 1. We advocated for that. That's not what EPA finalized. Not something that we're actively engaged on at the moment. I don't know much more I can really say about it other than, yes, we agree with you.
Hi, Tom Leon, Southwest Research Institute. I think a lot of people are skeptical that consumers are going to adopt EVs as quickly as the regulators hope. And that there's a lot of other headwinds that were alluded to by various speakers. So now that the EPA rules are final, what's plan B? If people don't buy them, does it simply mean you still need the same percentage new vehicles? You have to sell fewer vehicles to match the number of EVs that you can sell? Is there any flexibility or what's the recourse?
You want to try, Jimmy?
It's your industry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can't speak for any individual manufacturer. I mean, they'll probably all have their own plans. I think what we're seeing right now with this kind of initial retreat drawback, lessening of the rate of increase, however we want to describe it for electric vehicles, is manufacturers are looking much more closely at hybrids and plug-in hybrids. As I alluded to, I don't know if that's really going to be enough. But for today, the rules are what the rules are, and our automakers are going to have to comply with them. In the longer term, I think that we, as the auto industry, are probably going to be keeping a close eye on the development of EV infrastructure, EV market, supply chains, all of these things that go into the long list of what's going to be necessary to actually meet these goals. We call them the 10 commandments. So forgive me if I can't remember all 10 off the top of my head, and I'll not try to go through them each today. But these are all things that, I don't think any of us were in a position to say, let's have another midterm evaluation, if any of you are familiar with that term.
Please.
It didn't work out at all, right? I mean, it ended up being a political football, and it didn't accomplish anything from our perspective or the government's perspective. But I think over the next several years, we will be keeping close track of these 10 or so issues, and trying to see how they align to the projections that have been made. And if things are looking like they're going to go off the rails, I mean, certainly we're going to be talking to people about that and trying to get some changes. But otherwise, I mean, the law is the law. We have to comply with it. Well, and you come up with the potential pathways. You mentioned a couple of them.
Yeah, Rick Gazelle, Toyota. I would just add on, Mike, not an additional question. I think that, no, I can speak for one automotive company. We don't want to relive a midterm review or midterm evaluation. But I think that it's very likely that this is going to organically happen, and there's going to be a tracking of progress towards the standards. And it's also important to keep in mind there's going to be 2 presidential elections between now and when the last model year of standards that are currently in place.
Point, Rick.
Hi, Shailesh Lopez from General Motors. I have a question regarding the petroleum equivalency factor. Would you be able to comment on what the future looks like for the petroleum equivalency factor for flex fuel vehicles?
For what vehicles?
E85 flex fuel vehicles.
So, I mean, it's sort of irrelevant to a point, because EPA doesn't give them any credit, right? So you can't comply with EPA regulations by selling flex fuel vehicles, E85 vehicles. And in the statute, it says that E85 vehicles get a 0.15 multiplier. So it says it for those cars, but not for electric vehicles. That's one of the arguments against the subsidization of electric vehicles through the petroleum equivalency factor. So I think the statute, unless Congress amends it, it's still going to apply, but it's not going to have a huge impact on manufacturer choices, I think, unless EPA makes a change to its regulations.
Thank you.
Agree.
Michael Moore Stellantis, and Jimmy or Michael, you can answer this question if you can, but could you maybe describe some of the ability or differences between what CARB can do with their regulations versus EPA? And I'll just give you maybe one example, like the early ZEV, the first ZEV mandate. I think, don't quote me on the numbers, it was like 10% ZEVs in the early 2000 timeframe. And I think only just a few years ago, we kind of passed that mark. So for California.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going here, Michael. And I think the point you're raising is that CARB has historically been much more flexible in terms of how quickly they can react to market market and technology realities. So as you alluded to, and Reg probably knows this even better than I do, I'm sure. But CARB has a long history of setting aggressive standards, and then if things aren't quite working out, making adjustments from there. EPA is much more locked in. The Administrative Procedures Act requires significantly more effort to amend regulations. I guess I'd also comment that CARB has that ability to be more aggressive. EPA, at least in their interpretation, has been, they can't set a ZEV mandate, so they do it sideways, if you will, by lowering the emissions standards. But CARB can, has been found to be able to regulate with the ZEV mandate, or at least nobody's successfully challenged it thus far. I don't know if you want to add anything, Jimmy.
No, I mean, there are arguments that CARB cannot impose ZEV mandates under the statute for the NHTSA administers, the CAFE statute. I mean, still there's one suit that I'm aware of in Minnesota. I think those suits are going to have to wait until the ACT2 waiver sort of gets cleared by EPA, and then you might see some of them, which might change sort of California's role in mandating electrification. I'm sure they'll find other ways to try to push the envelope. But yeah, that might be the next thing for California.
Yeah, and there's lots of options for California, right? I mean, if they don't have a ZEV mandate, you just lower the criteria emissions level to 0, and that's a ZEV mandate also, just as an example, right? I mean, you think there's an easy out, and there really isn't.
And federal administrations come and go, but CARB is here to stay, right?
Yeah. At least much more consistent in their views.
Michael Bushbacher at Boyd and Gray. I think EPA projected for the light duty rule some like 800 billion in direct technology costs. I'm very curious about the auto industry's view of what this is going to do to costs and to how many new cars get sold, because if cost goes up, presumably that's going to depress sales. So I'm curious for what you see the reality of the next 5-6 years being in terms of vehicle costs and how, what the market is for new vehicles.
Yeah, so let me answer from a personal perspective. As a trade association, obviously, we're not talking about costs and, the costs or how many vehicles will be sold. The closest we would come is, okay, EPA projected XYZ, right? Do we generally agree with that or not? So a personal view here, just kind of as an observer of the auto industry and experience in it, is yeah, costs are going to go up. Electric vehicles are still $10,000 to $15,000 more expensive to produce than internal combustion engine vehicles, probably even more so. There's public data from companies like Ford Motor Company that have separate EV divisions, and of course they're losing money. On the other hand, Tesla is making money, perhaps on the backs of some of the regulatory credits that they're selling. I haven't looked at the math lately to see how much that's a part of that, where that balance completely gets struck. But yeah, vehicles are going to be more expensive. Dealers are certainly concerned that EVs are more difficult to sell, and that sales may decline because of that. I'm not a personal believer in EPA's, everybody wins theory.
Yeah.
Michael, as I look around the room, I see a number of very seasoned and experienced fuels and systems engineers from the auto family. And it's obvious that there's been an erosion of some capacity within the automakers to design to meet these ever increasingly stringent standards. So if this reality is what we're facing, what's it going to take in terms of the capacity of the human intellect to be able to design the systems to meet these new standards? Are the automakers gearing up to replace the retirees we've got in the room here? How are we going to fill that gap? Either if we stay the course with the standards, or there's relaxation and there's a realization that these technologies can still deliver improvements? How does the industry build back the capacity?
That's a tough question, Ernie. Right now, obviously, the automakers are investing in electric vehicles. They're pulling back investments in ICEs, although there are still some things happening in that space, right? Certainly in the hybrid space. You know, our position in general is that electrification is the future here. If there's a drawback, are you going to expect automakers to just forego the hundreds of billions of dollars investment that they've made in electric vehicles? I kind of doubt it, right? What that means for our ability to reinvest in internal combustion engine vehicles, I don't want to say it's a dead end, but I wouldn't, if I was a student today, I don't know if I'd want to be actively chasing it. I don't know, Rick, do you have any other thoughts that you have in that area? Sorry to put you on the spot. You usually have something to say though.
I think I can share some of that tomorrow in
Okay.
my talk with the approach that we're taking at Toyota. I would say that when you think about it, there are probably still some frontiers with internal combustion engines, but for the most part, you're chasing diminishing returns anyway. So I don't know how much more design, you really could be achieving. There's low lean burn combustion and things like that are happening. But I think that regulations aside, there is going to be a transition to some extent towards electrification because it has unmatchable efficiency of the electric machine. And you start to move from one S curve, so to speak, to another in jumping from gasoline to electrification. So it's probably going to happen no matter what. I think which is really comes into question here is the pace at which the regulators are pushing.
That's great. It's a great point. So I guess we talked to you. That's great.
As one of those grizzled veterans who spent 32 years at Ford, I'd like to throw in my own 2 cents. I would agree that focusing on the engine itself, there are diminishing returns on IC engine technology, but I think the variety of hybrid systems on the market is pretty remarkable. And what stands out to me is that the best hybrids are a lot better than the hybrids that are currently used on trucks and SUVs. So the best hybrids are the power splits that are used exclusively on passenger cars and light duty kind of crossover vehicles. And they get about 30% overall fuel economy benefit. Whereas the hybrid systems used on trucks and SUVs that can tow significant loads are more like 10 to 15% fuel economy benefit. So in my view, the opportunity is how do we figure out how to get some of the truck attributes such as towing in a hybrid system that delivers better fuel economy benefits. And I think there are examples in the past. General Motors did a really nice job on the dual mode power split in the early 2000s that I think achieved both. And I think we may hopefully see some investment in that area in the future if automakers can afford to invest still in hybrid architectures.
So, and I just say, Tom, to add on to that, Toyota considers conventional hybrids an electrified powertrain. So that's part of the transition.
That's a good point too. Yeah.
Good. So there's some hope.
Yeah. And forgive me if I sound hopeless. I mean, I was thinking more in the internal combustion. How do I calibrate a vehicle space?
This is your chance to ask the question that's been the forefront of your minds, so keep thinking them up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ernie. So just wanted to go back to this E10 cert fuel that's going to be recognized in 2027, that all vehicles can be certified on that. Couple questions there. So that removes the penalties that the autos have received in the past on a CO2 debit using an ethanol blend.
Yes. So right now, all the greenhouse gas and fuel economy testing is done on E0 still. If you were to, EPA proposed in 2020, essentially, they said our greenhouse gas rule is premised on E0. So if we test on E10, that's getting you a benefit that's undeserved, is essentially their position. So instead of making that change immediately and pushing us into E10 immediately, they said, okay, one of our points as the auto industry was, well, let's just not make this change at all until you do a new greenhouse gas rulemaking, then you can just account for it in the standards if that's really your position. And that's essentially what they've done, is they said, okay, we'll draw the line at 2027. We're setting new greenhouse gas standards. Now, we will premise these standards on E10. I think that's more lip service than technical reality, but that be that as it may, that's what they've done and said, okay, the new greenhouse gas standards are premised on E10, so there's no need to penalize you for using a lower carbon fuel any longer.
So will you be getting a benefit though on certifying on E10 versus E0 with the E10 carrying ethanol with the lower carbon score?
Yeah, I think the test results themselves will show a lower carbon dioxide value. So even an existing vehicle that's retested on E10 at that point will get that nominal carbon benefit.
So any sliver of an opening of going to a E15 and higher blends for testing and certification through this rule?
Not through this rule, but I think EPA is considering, fuels still. I don't recall exactly when they thought they might act on it, but they took comment on it in the proposed rule. I think the problem is the same that we ran into in 2020. If E15 were to become the test fuel before 2032 or 2033, when the subsequent rulemaking would happen, I think that their thought process would be to penalize the E15 at that point until they set a new greenhouse gas rule again.
Well, it seems like that's a point that we can all get around here that we've been talking about for a long time, is a higher blend of ethanol being used as a possible cert fuel, with the autos getting the credit for the CO2 reductions and the efficiency improvements.
Yeah, to one of Jimmy's points earlier, I think that it would help to have legislation that clearly define that to EPA that, okay, get a lower carbon fuel out there and don't penalize the EPA. I think that would be a key part of any legislation if we wanted to see the benefit in terms of testing. And obviously, as automakers will test on what EPA tells us to. That makes sense to you too?
Chip, you're kind of hanging out there looking a little lonely. So question for you. So historically, we've relied on gas taxes, federal and state gas taxes, to help cover infrastructure costs that are associated with mobility. As we move away from gas-powered vehicles and move to electrification, we still have to maintain infrastructure, and there are issues around whether or not battery electric vehicles are carrying their fair share. What has any of these discussions come up in your commenting on the logic of proceeding with a BEV almost only path?
Short answer is no, they're not carrying their weight. Yeah, I think that's something that need to be addressed, is that, the liquid fuels are carrying most of the tax burden. And some of the interesting things Transportation Energy Institute looks at is the weight of the EVs and the wear and tear that are going to happen on the roads. I mean, that's a potential downside. And so there's probably going to need to be more investment, not less. And so I think there needs to be some fundamental changes in how cities, counties, states fund those programs. But I'm not aware of any efforts to shift that to BEVs yet, but.
There's some limited state laws, right? There are some limited state laws, registration fees and things like that. Our trade association's position is that battery electric vehicles can have some sort of fuel tax, if you will, but it should be equal to or equivalent to ICEs, not, something that's punitive to them.
Other questions? This is your chance. The afternoon session was set aside to pick apart these complex, very dense rules. We've got experts here that have spent a lot of time poring over them, commenting on them. Other questions or comments, observations?
I'll take it if you want. I'll take the general question that doesn't really have a question unless Michael's got one here.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna make an observation that we're in a pretty mixed time politically around EVs, around liquid fuels. And I think there's maybe opportunities in that mix, but politically, EVs are football. I'm sure Alexander will touch on this more tomorrow, but Republicans hate them, Democrats love them. We can just generalize at that point. From a legislative standpoint, we're looking at a lot of industrial policy. So are we improving environmental policy versus industrial policy, and kind of a combination of those two? Customers are at this kind of cusp. Are we running out of these early adopters? What do we do next? It was asked earlier, what happens if people don't adopt all these EVs that we're going to have to build? So I think that there's a lot of noise politically right now still around this, and a lot of opportunities for discussion about the directions that the country is heading. And I'm not saying we change direction. The auto industry appreciates some certainty and stability in terms of regulation. There's a lot of money that's gone into the electric vehicle pathway. But at the same time, I think, we can recognize in here too that lower carbon liquid fuels, especially if they could be applied to, the car park in addition to new vehicles, would also have significant carbon reducing benefits. And if the ultimate goal is lower carbon, I think it would be a shame to ignore obvious pathways personally. So Michael, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had another question. Actually, it's kind of related to what you were talking about, but it's maybe more directed at Chip. Was there's kind of this at least what opportunity are there opportunities in the refining sector to reduce carbon of the petroleum type product? And I don't know what might be some levers needed to kind of facilitate its introduction into the market.
Yeah, so there certainly are ways. So our refinery in Minnesota, Rosemont, Minnesota, we have a 45 megawatt solar array generating power right now. When you look at our total energy, it's not huge, but it's significant. And we're looking at other ways, heat integration on the front end of a refinery. We buy a lot of natural gas. There's other ways to generate heat on the front end. So I'm an ex-Navy nuke sub guy. So you might imagine where we've gone there. There's, advanced reactors coming out, and different companies are making investments there and looking at that. But you could put a lot of heat in the front end of a refinery that's zero carbon using that. So I think there's opportunities there. When you look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, though, scope 3 is still the dominant part of that when you look at the total emissions. But it's possible to reduce, the carbon footprints of those. A lot of the majors are looking at electrification throughout. That's a bit of the comment I made earlier. Everyone's looking to electrify everything. But we're going to be constrained, I think, by supply and supply chains there. But there are some opportunities. I think fuel is probably the biggest opportunity, but there's other opportunities for sure.
Let's pull on that. Thanks, Ernie. Let's pull on that thread a little bit. What kind of regulatory framework would help reduce the burden for you guys to actually introduce that and try and meet some targeted goals that we can all play in the space, not just electrification?
So regulatory to help with.
Yeah, I mean, changes to current policy that would allow you to meet some compliance standards that would allow more longevity to the internal combustion engine.
Okay, that's broader. I thought you were back on the refinery there, but yeah, I mean, one of the things that AFPM certainly has been working closely with ethanol on, a 95 RON or certainly an E15. I think there's plenty of room to go there. I think it's shifted from ethanol versus oil to liquid transportation versus electrification. And again, not that it's a fight. I think I agree, EVs are coming. It's just how long. And in the meantime, there's a massive opportunity for us to improve liquid transportation fuels. So from what needs to happen, obviously, if we had something like an E15 legislation versus fighting over 1 pound waivers in 8 Midwestern states. I mean, I think things like that would be, is a good first step. But I think as we go to higher ethanol blends, I think there is an infrastructure question that maybe is on the agenda for tomorrow. What will it take to do that? And again, I worry about competing capital for all that infrastructure, especially if you're trying to add EVs on top of it. I think it's a difficult thing. So, and I'm just speaking as Chip, not as anybody else, as I opined on that, but.
Say the auto industry isn't super out in front on this topic anymore because there's just so many tails with the EV part of it, but there needs to be a political willingness to say there's multiple solutions here and that we don't need to. I'm saying this wrong. It's not that we don't need to get to zero or whatever the answer is, but that the policies right now or the politics of it are go straight to EVs. That's the ultimate solution. Don't stop any place in the middle. And I'm not suggesting that we stop, but nobody's really looking at this holistically as multiple solutions. They're looking at one solution and everything is pushing us towards that one solution right now. So policies that were more holistic and a more of a political will to acknowledge the role of liquid fuels as part of the solution, especially given that there will be many internal combustion engine vehicles, even in the EPA and even in CARB's view, right? Up to 20% plug-in hybrids. All those plug-in hybrids still use gasoline at some point or another, or some other form of liquid fuel, right? Taking action in the liquid fuel spaces still has value in my mind, and it's just takes some political willpower to be able to stand up and say, time out, it's not just EVs, there's more to be done here.
Alexander Edwards, you've mentioned my name a couple of times, so I figured I had to at least say something that's mentioned here. And like normal, when I speak, it's going to piss somebody off, so please forgive me. I think there's one part of this conversation that we're sort of missing. I've been doing work for consumer research in EVs, alternate powertrains since the 80s. And I've been in midterm reviews, national academies. I've been to all of these discussions where regulators and policymakers are talking about what do we want to do. And while this may not be universally true, it is generally true. Most policymakers have a quiet agenda to end the idea of personal mobility. And that's why we have policy that does not make any sense. Why it flies in the face of everything saying, well, wait a second, we're not going to see exponential growth. Wait, we're not going to force people that are mowing people's lawn to go out and buy a Ford F-150 Lightning to put the lawnmower in the back of. That's just not possible when it comes to these things. And we all know it. I mean, you can have these conversations and with policymakers and they'll just nod and smile. At the New York Auto Show, I was listening to some of the policymakers saying, well, our next big thing, and I don't know if you heard this when they were talking about, let's make the gas tank in liquid fuels smaller. That way we can solve the range disparity. No, that's real. That was literally, Rick, am I wrong? I'm sure you heard that. What was that? Okay, so what I'm saying is these people are not, they do not care about reality. They're going to legislate and they're going to create policy until, rather than fighting these things separately, everyone gets together, finds out who your main voice is going to be and say, I'm sorry, there's some shenanigans. And while there is a general piece that sure, Democrats are more often for EVs and Republicans are not. You'll see that data in some things we talk about tomorrow. When Republicans buy EVs, they love them. When Democrats buy their ICE, they love those pieces too. There is a pathway to appeal to all policymakers, regardless of their political bias, and be able to say, we are going to do X. I mean, even though I've seen Toyota get beaten up a lot, it sounds like the only sane strategy. And it needs to be more than just Toyota saying, hey, we're going to stand here alone and let others, sort of not get beaten up in the press the way that we do. I'm glad that you're doing things like this because my voice, what I stand here for is the consumer, and the consumers have no interest in this policy. And I can tell you that it's not going to, things are going to change, or we're going to ask the Chinese government to come over and take over our transportation sector. Because we can make a number of rules that will be very helpful for consumers, saying, if you want a license plate and you want to drive Tuesdays and Thursdays, sure, we can make that policy. But it's not going to fly, at least not in this country. And again, EVs are coming, was in Beijing just last week. And there's a lot of amazing things that those vehicles are going to do. But it is, as I said at dinner last night, and I keep going to, policymakers are self-delusional, crack-smoking ferrets that have their own agenda of ending personal mobility. And that is, tell me that I'm wrong. I'm sorry, you're in for a keynote tomorrow that's going to be a little bit outrageous. I hope I haven't pissed anybody off there too much. But that's just my comments, is that we're taking seriously this regulation. And I hope that by the end of this, 48 hours, that everyone here's come together and said, okay, we're going to put together a couple of folks that are going to go directly to the policymakers and say, you emperors have no clothes. You've got nothing that is absolutely real. We already know when we get to these certain areas, it's not going to happen. Those shifts are delusional, and I believe that if you call them out publicly and educate the consumers of these vehicles of what's going on, if they truly understood, hey, you know what, if we don't put in some sort of ethanol blend to bring down CO2, which will help Democrat policymakers say yes, and that will avoid EV mandates, which will make Republican policymakers a little happier. You can get that move forward and be more effective rather than just. Anyway, I'm going to be done there. I'm now ranting on a soapbox there. Thank you.
Sounds like you're priming the pump for tomorrow.
Good. No, you're not wrong.
Yeah, so I think
We have to live in the political reality we live in, but yes.
We need to go and address that political reality that's being created for us and say, you are doing things that are not real. Let's go back and take it. Sure, regulate all you want to, but all of those automotive manufacturers, this is what we're doing. And we're going to call all the consumers out to make sure they understand what we're doing. I think that's really scared them more than anything. But we have been chasing all of these mandates, putting all this money, knowing full well every step of the way, the consumer isn't there yet. Because just like in 1986, my first EV project, while there's a lot of great benefits that are coming, there are too many compromises for it to be 100%. Nonetheless 50, nonetheless 25 in the next 7 years.
Mhm.
I will start.
Andrew Frizella, US Car. I guess one of my questions is, how do we reframe this narrative? Because to extend the analogy, the emperor has no clothes. I'd at least like to offer him a see-through robe. And at least something, right? The problem is, in my opinion, the us versus them of all of this. And to me, I took this Alan Alda course on science communication, where they really focus on the yes and. So electrification, yes, and liquid renewable fuels. Even within SAE, it's really hard to get them to stop comparing ICE to EV. That's not the right question. The question is hybrid versus EV, right? And I think there's a really great opportunity to promote liquid fuels for the car park, for the transition times and all this, right? I think Cummins took a beautiful approach on this, in my opinion, where they said, yeah, sure, we're going to get to full EVs, but on the way, because we recognize it's a transition, we're going to do this. And recently there's been a lot more recognition of conflict minerals, a new term I didn't realize. I mean, I knew the problems with cobalt. I hadn't heard it called that. Blood cobalt, conflict minerals. And I'm just wondering if we can take this opportunity to reframe and really focus on the yes and hybrids and liquid renewable fuels and get people on that page. You know, today there was a GM announcement that they're coming back to PHEVs in 2027. So they're starting to shift back. It feels like the momentum is building in this direction. But can we, you know, can we at least in this room maybe agree that that's our narrative and go out and start spreading that message? Because the one voice, right? The speaking with one voice is kind of the only way we're going to get a message out to the people that can only remember, you know, 5-second sound bites for TV.
One quick one.
Quick one, just sort of funny. At the NADA convention this year, when they were at Las Vegas National Dealer Association, they invited all the automotive executives, dealers, et cetera, to go down to the Sphere and watch Postcards from Earth, which has wonderful scenes of how automobiles and blood cobalt are going to destroy the planet. You've never seen so many automotive people walk out of a presentation in disgust. Anyway. You didn't know that.
Yeah, I'd been a little bit hesitant to make a comment on a subject because one of the things you're really worried about is I'm about to mention a study, and my fear is everybody here has already seen it and it's not very good, but I will mention it anyway. There was a study that came out of France regarding plug-in hybrid electric vehicles operating on E85. And their conclusion was that those vehicles, given the fact that so much of the electricity that an EV uses is generated by fossil fuels, that those were that an EV PHEV run on E85 was essentially equivalent to an electric vehicle. And if we start thinking imaginatively like that, we could perhaps have a very interesting way to frame a new message to regulators. Just a thought.
Michael, how are we doing on time? Maybe 2 more comments, questions? What? Okay. Couple more. This is your chance.
Yeah, when you were talking, I had an immediate reaction, but then I really liked Andrea's reaction too. I think it's a very positive reaction to say, you know, yes, and. But what if we explore the worst case scenario, which I think is worst case for everyone involved? So what if EVs don't take off with consumers and or there's lots of other roadblocks and automakers are unable to sell very many vehicle or, you know, enough EVs to meet the EPA mandates? Then they have to cut back on total sales to still maintain enough percentage of EVs to meet the standards. So they're going to have trouble. Automakers are not going to like that scenario because they're not going to make much money with very reduced vehicle sales. New car buyers are not going to like that scenario because they're not going to have the selection of new cars that they want and need. Older vehicles are going to stay on the road for longer, and you know we're not going to achieve the environmental benefits that regulators and environmentalists want either. So no one's going to be happy. So I get back to my same question of what's the plan B? Is it, you know, elections and a change of political direction and update the regulations? Or is it just everyone's just going to suffer until we reach the end of the regulatory period? Or I just don't know. Just throwing it out there if anyone on the podium or the audience wants to speak up and address that worst case scenario, what's going to happen?
So I think CARB's position on these questions is that when something's not working, it means you need more of it. So I assume what they're going to do is to try to replicate what I was talking about with advanced clean fleets, right? So purchase mandates, we're going to see that proliferate in California and other states for fleets. And then they're gonna see that, turnover is slowing down, so they're gonna force retirement of internal combustion engines. They're gonna see that, greenhouse gas emissions are not going down as much because of a rebound effect. So they're gonna do what they're already doing in California, which is limit vehicle miles traveled. This gets back to the point that the ultimate goal here is to limit mobility, not to, transition to EVs. So yeah, that's what we're gonna see on that side of the aisle. The question is, what are other people gonna do to push back?
I would just add it, all these things we're talking about are inflationary. And so we're talking about all these scenarios, and that's when political changes happen, right? It's when economies struggle. So I think that's what it leads to. It leads to changeover in leadership, but just wish we had, never mind. I won't go there.
Okay, any final question or comment? If not, we're going to take a 10-minute stretch break and come back at 4 o'clock. But I don't want to shut anybody down if you've got a burning question. Okay, we'll see none. Michael, we'll have them back at 4. Okay, everybody, enjoy your
All right, everybody, we're gonna get going. You can take a seat. We're gonna get going on our final two presentations of this afternoon. Our next presenter is Stefan Mueller. Stefan Mueller is a principal economist at the University of Chicago, at the University of Illinois at Chicago Energy Resources Center, where he leads the Bioenergy and Sustainable Landscapes Research Group. His research activities focus on life cycle emissions analysis of fuel pathways, including greenhouse gas emission assessments from land use change related to biofuel production, quantification of carbon emissions and sequestration effects from production, agriculture, and tailpipe emission assessments from biofuel combustion. Dr. Mueller has published over 20 peer-reviewed papers on life cycle analysis with a wide network of collaborators. And today, Stefan will be presenting on updates to Argonne GREET model. So please welcome Stefan. And there's a link.
Do we have a portable phone? No. Would be helpful. Yeah, I think that's better. So. Oh, okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'll talk a little bit about updates to the GREET model. There's been a lot going on within the GREET group and lots of new releases. So I'll talk a little bit about that, especially as this impacts corn ethanol production. So number one here, updates to GREET. If you go to greet.anl.gov, you see all the different GREET modules that are listed here. GREET got renamed to R&D GREET. I think that's to sort of set it apart from all the sort of GREET versions that are used in regulatory under regulatory programs, you know, like California GREET, but also all the tax tools related to GREET, such as the 40B SAF GREET that was released 2 weeks ago. Another important GREET tool that was recently updated is the feedstock CI calculator tool. That is sort of the main module used in sort of climate smart practices and how to incorporate, you know, agriculture, GHG reductions in agriculture into the GREET model. So that's that feedstock CI calculator tool here mentioned. So what drives differences in biofuels carbon scores? So some broad categories are how the feedstock is grown. Again, climate smart agriculture. Do we use cover crops, optimized and nitrogen use, conservation tillage, nitrification inhibitors? All of that have the potential and are in reality reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture that goes into the ethanol life cycle pathway. Then we can do carbon capture, sequestration, CCSU, and utilization of the fermentation CO2 at ethanol plants. That's a big deal. In the Midwest, we see the pipelines being planned at least to collect CO2. And then we are seeing wells being drilled under several plants right now to sequester CO2 into geological formations. And then there's additional new technologies that I talk a little bit. There was some mentioning on the refinery side, like electric, you know, increased electric use as electric storage and things like that. So, and then finally, I talk about iLook. iLook is also a way to obviously reduce the life cycle of corn ethanol, and a highly uncertain science, but we've done some work on that as well.
So first of all, upgrades to the FDCIC calculator tool. So I see a lot of people, within the Con community here. So that's quite topical. Then there was a new release of that calculator tool, and now so this is brand new, actually a brand new graph that I put together on Airplane Ride on during Friday, Saturday, Sunday last week, and I want to explain it to you because it provides a lot of insight. So that is basically what the calculator tool does. It basically allows you to calculate sort of the CI score on a county by county basis for different crops produced in that county using different climate smart agricultural practices. And so this is the multi-crop calculator tab using a corn soil rotation. And so this is Illinois, right? So now I want to walk you through this because there's some pretty cool findings in there, at least by my thinking. So on average, and it's all converted now, not in grams greenhouse gas per bushel, but in grams per megajoule, contributing to the life cycle of ethanol. So the baseline is 28 grams per megajoule of corn agriculture that is contributed to the corn ethanol life cycle from corn agriculture. So 28 grams per megajoule, right? These are the southern counties, Williamson and Fayette in Illinois. These are the more northern counties. So you can see in the southern counties, we generally have a little bit lower yields, lower nitrogen use efficiency. And so the ethanol produced contributes over 30 grams per megajoule to the life cycle. If we do add no-till in, it's lower. And then if we add cover crop in, right, it's substantially lower, the life cycle of that corn ethanol. So all of a sudden, we are just contributing about 21 grams per megajoule to the overall life cycle. As we go towards the northern counties, that the higher yielding counties, better nitrogen use efficiency, we now see all of those dropping below the US average baseline, right, in those counties. And then again, we got our reduced till further, reduces a further drop to the baseline. And then again, we add cover crop, right? And, we're substantially lower, just, we're saving between 28. So now we're only down to 17.2 grams per megajoule and not 28. So we're saving about 10 grams per megajoule with all these practices, 10 grams per megajoule. Which also happens to be the number for these practices in, foreshadowing what I talk about in the under the 40B SAF tax incentives. So, but what's important is, although those southern counties are above the US average, once you add in the benefits of cover crop, they're really quite equal. So then we're at 21.4 grams per megajoule, 18.7 grams per megajoule. Very similar now all of a sudden to the northern counties. And that is because we assume that the cover crop in the southern counties gets better established, produces more biomass, right? And so it equals out in the end. If you produce all these practices, the southern counties, have a CI contribution that's very much in line with the northern counties in Illinois. So it speaks to this finding that it's very spatially explicit or very geographically varied, right? So we really have to look at the opportunities for climate smart agriculture for each region. Each region can contribute to climate smart agriculture with the right technology. What else can ethanol plants do? So that was climate smart agriculture, right? So that's large potential. And even more so, there's more techniques out there than the ones I just showed in the feedstock CI calculator tool. But even the ones I showed, provide significant reductions in that updated model. So then obviously we can do carbon capture sequestration at an ethanol plant, provides about 25 grams per megajoule, maybe 30 grams per megajoule of savings to the life cycle of corn ethanol. And then there's new plant technologies. It was mentioned before, and I do see this more and more. I was on a call with somebody who wants to do hot stone storage, meaning use renewable electricity, heat up stones, and then use that for heating requirements within the ethanol plants. But we do hear that quite a bit. Just talked to Stefan Unasch at Lifecycle Associates, who also talks to a lot of people in that space. Electrification of boilers, dryers at ethanol plants. So there's a lot of companies coming out of the woodwork on that. And it needs to be carefully considered so that these technologies are optimized, that you don't just want to electrify your dryer. You want to electrify the boiler function to a degree, right? You have a bigger impact. You want to do arbitrage, peak versus you want to reduce obviously your peak demand charge at the ethanol plant with that, and not add to the peak demand charge of the ethanol plant. But I think this is certainly now a field where a lot of people take a second look at, for sure, going forward. And another big category, again, where we can see, that where we can work to reduce the overall life cycle of corn ethanol produced, is again in the ILUC, or induced land use change area. For example, this is a table under CORSIA, the Carbon Offset Risk and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It's under the International Civil Aviation Association, ICAO organization, I should say, ICAO. And it's a global carbon reduction scheme that a lot of airlines commit to. Worldwide. And ICAO calculated default values. And so we can see, for example, how US soybean oil has a core LCA of 40.4. Core LCA is basically to calculate, it's basically the fuel production, right? But then we have this ILUC data, look at this, of 24.5 grams per megajoule, highly punitive for US-based soybean oils going into SAF. And it's about the same for US corn grain, where the core LCA is 55.8 grams per megajoule. And again, a punitive 22.1 grams per megajoule added to that life cycle, really significantly reducing the value and the advantage of using a corn ethanol-based sustainable aviation fuel. So we really have to work on this ILUC value here, and which we have done actually behind the scenes here. Been quite busy on that. So the first paper that I want to mention, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, was funded with several corn growing organizations. 6 states funded it. And it's considered historical land use when estimating soil carbon stock changes of transitional croplands. When calculating ILUC, these models like GTAP, which stands for Global Trade Analysis Project at Purdue University, and sort of the ILUC model within the Argonne Grid model, they're really relying on transitional lands, or called the cropland pasture transition, one of the land categories that is accessed when more land is needed to provide feedstock for a new biofuels policy, right, in those models. So these transitional lands, and understanding the carbon implication of these transitional lands is very important, and has been lacking in the past. So wrote a publication that's hopefully helpful, and it's got quite a bit of attention. We presented it to USDA a couple of times, showed it to US EPA, and it's gotten some good attention here. Then in parallel, we've also worked with Purdue University. Purdue contributes the ILUC calculations under CORSIA-SAF for the US delegation. And then there's also the European delegation who contributes iLook values, and then those two are actually synced up or negotiated between those two models to derive a final value that's general somewhere in the middle between two models. But we worked again with Purdue University to implement a new database, an updated database that should further reduce those values or show to further reduce those values on SAF. But we also enabled Purdue to use some of the carbon accounting databases in the Argonne model directly in their calculation. What had happened was that for a reason that I do not know, Purdue had actually used the California carbon accounting model and coupled that with their economic model to derive the iLook value. So what we worked with Purdue with now is to program the GTAP model so it can also use that Argonne-based carbon accounting model and generate iLook values. So that should make, that'll bring those iLook values down as we have seen here. And there will be more work done on this and a publication done on that. But that's sort of important work, I feel, behind the scenes. And then I have worked, also produced a report, it's a while ago by now, under CORSIA. You can also use a very low carbon ethanol or even low carbon heifer feedstock if you use reclaimed lands. So low risk iLook land as a feedstock under CORSIA is a bigger deal. And so that opens up, you know, using reclaimed coal lands, marginal lands, things like that for SAF production. So yeah, the land use discussion behind CORSIA is complex. You know, we have to sort of just really keep working on just updating all the databases behind iLook and bringing those iLook values down because they're very punitive, right? The alternative, you know, I'd rather see my personal, if I had my personal wishes, I would get rid of the iLook values altogether under CORSIA and would institute like a, you know, deforestation-free policy where you track deforestation with satellites, you know, but, you know, and every once in a while, some people share that opinion, but I just think it's just a very uncertain science. Nevertheless, I think we need to keep informing it. And so again, I'm coming back here to that one paper that we've written. Again, we looked at all of the states here, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, six states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Missouri, and I see a lot of the supporting organizations here actually in the audience. So we looked at states that had been, counties that had been previously, let me go back, previously identified by a researcher called Tyler Lark out of Wisconsin, that had been previously identified to show tremendous land use change in response to corn soy expansion. That researcher is known to sort of, in my opinion, maybe exaggerate the land use changes that we're seeing. We do not see these land use changes, but we looked at the parcels that researcher had identified and listed on the internet in a georeferenced way. We talked to several growers about their behavior, including growers that, you know, had these parcels, were farming these parcels, right? And had done some land use changes on them. And then what we did is we constructed the true land use history and fed them into the CELUS model that's developed by Michigan State University by Professor Bruno Basso, just to see how the values for these transitional lands would compare to the current values in the Argonne model. And so what we found is a lot of the previous studies that look at land use change. So they look at, okay, land use change has taken place with a start of the RFS or right before, let's say 2005-6, and then they look for it till 2015-16, right? And then they say, okay, oh, we saw some grassland conversions. This is not the right way to look at it, as we found, because almost all of those parcels that we looked at, 98% were all in agriculture. They were all in agriculture in the 80s, right? And so their carbon profile, because of that, is much different from a native grassland, as was shown and as was asserted in some of those publications. So that's the number one finding. We also learned from all the grower interviews that yes, even if growers own grassland that's been a long time in grassland, the first land parcels they re-access is the ones they had been using previously for agriculture, right? So CRP land, short-term CRP land, that routes back into agriculture. And then largely, when we put the land use history into the Cellus model, into Bruno Basso's Cellus model, we got very similar results to the Argonne numbers, right? Basically, we confirmed and corroborated those soil carbon numbers in the Argonne model. And those are basically the soil carbon numbers, right, that you see here, right? So these are, I have to go back on. These are those soil carbon numbers, right? That shows you these savings from climate smart agricultural practices, right? The response of the soils and the additional sequestration of carbon in the soils in response to climate smart agriculture. So yeah, that's very much confirming that the Argonne CCLAP model produces directly the correct soil carbon implications for transitional lands. The other big model that was released now is obviously the 40B SAF module. It was released just about 2 weeks ago. And these are some of the screenshots from the 40B model. So now we got to think SAF, right? So a couple important points here. This is the corn alcohol to jet process. ILUC is 11.1. So it appeared to me, and Chris, you know this better. I think it was the ILUC was 8, and then EPA, I think added some additional emissions components on top of it. So it ended up being about 11.1 grams per megajoule. It's obviously, I remember I showed you the Corsia value, which was 22 and some grams per megajoule. So it's less than half of the ILUC value that's in Corsia. That's encouraging. I do think we could probably reduce that down the road further. A large part of the pathway is the feedstock, which includes our corn agriculture, but also the plant energy. So again, big opportunities here for reductions with climate smart agriculture, as I pointed out, as well as new plant technologies, heifer pathways. So heifer are a little bit better positioned. That total LCA is 39.9 grams per megajoule. Corn ethanol is 73. And then here, this is sugarcane ethanol, 61.1 grams per megajoule. I think there's still a lot to digest on these models, but you know, out now for what they're worth. One of the important provisions is this agricultural pilot that's in there. USDA agricultural pilot that allows you to bundle. If you bundle cover crop, no-till, enhanced efficiency fertilizer, you save 10 grams per megajoule reduction. And for soy, if you bundle cover, no-till, you save 5 grams per megajoule. My critique on this would be that it's a little bit limiting that you have to bundle all three of them in the first place. Plus, there's also a lot more, several more climate smart practices already set up in GREET, such as manure, use of manure, green ammonia. There's also, it's a little bit vague, the definition of energy efficiency enhanced fertilizer. I'd like to probably see that split out between products like NSERF and slow release fertilizer. In addition to like things like 4R technologies, I feel like there could be multiple credits, should be multiple credit points possible just within that category. So I think also further room for commenting here as we go forward and look at other tax credits that are coming up. So with that, biofuels, key challenges and developments. The challenges are going to be ILUC. The challenge is ILUC, right? It's just, again, it's just disincentivizing the use of a particular feedstock in the corn soy sector, particularly ILUC under CORSIA, which is really punitive. What I just mentioned, bundling of ag practices, I think there's a lot of opportunity beyond just the 10 grams per megajoule savings that are currently codified in that USDA pilot. There's more opportunities. And then there's, another challenge obviously is, while there's opportunities in climate smart ag, right, we have to finance that. So hopefully some of the growers will see some of those tax benefits. Technology development, I think we got to push within an ethanol plant as well that I mentioned, this electric storage technologies, reducing thermal and natural gas use as an ethanol plant, renewable electricity, installations on ethanol plant grounds. I think that could go a long way. Remember that the Brazilians are building this eucalyptus fired ethanol plants where they take eucalyptus into a biomass boiler, which is counted as carbon neutral. So want to watch that a bit and counteract it with technologies here. But there's obviously a lot of good opportunities here that we have in the US. Again, lots of expertise and data availability in the US. We got high corn soy yields, high standability, low prevent plant in our corn belt. We have the option to do carbon capture and sequestration in Illinois and Indiana. A lot of plants are directly located above the Mount Simon sandstone formation, and there's other areas across the US as well where we can do direct injection into those geological formations without having to build a very long pipeline. And so that's a big opportunity. Really makes corn ethanol a very low carbon fuel. We have some availability of low risk lands that I mentioned. All of that, can be considered in the latest versions, certainly of the R&D grid model. It's all set up. And hopefully a lot of it makes its way into some of those tax incentives, which we've seen good indication for when we look at the 40B model that was released about 2 weeks ago. That's it. That's a little bit overview of what's going on with GREED. From my perspective, new publications that I hope help with some of the problems that we're seeing, holding maybe the corn ethanol pathway more down than it should. And the opportunities we see. Any questions? Chris?
Stephen, you talked about the uncertainty for ILUC. Canada doesn't include it because of that uncertainty. Do you think that's a better approach, or do you think they have shortcomings too?
No, I mean, any policy that does not include ILUC is a better policy, in my opinion. Yeah, no, absolutely. I absolutely agree. If you think about it, it goes all the way back to in Europe, it's not included either, right? It's not included, has not been included. They report it at the country level, right? They have to report ILUC. I think that would have been a good model for CORSIA to take over, right? It did not happen. So look, I work on ILUC in a sense of, that we want to show that it should be a very small impact. ILUC in itself, just from a intellectual point of view, that is ILUC, right? So if you happen to have a huge policy, you're gonna have some adjustments in crop rotations, and you're gonna have some adjustments in import export. However, what we've seen has been such a tremendous yield increase, such a tremendous increase in co-products that are being produced, and if you do even the calculations, they're almost fully offsetting any of those impacts, right? And so that's why I think we just have a lot more work to do on this. So I'm fundamentally not an ILUC friend. Other questions? I might not be seeing it. Yeah, go on. Yeah. You might have to, I don't see so well.
When you're looking at adding something new, it's expanding the Greek model to include new practices, right? Specifically within climate smart agriculture. I know a lot of us were very unhappy with the bundling that came out with 40B, and we would love to not now 45Z. But realistically, I mean, how long does it take you to evaluate a new practice, get that CI score incorporated into the model to potentially have something that's more like a pick list and choosing different things for a farm operation, or that an ethanol plant can ask for in terms of being able to, as that progresses along into new credits or new policies? What is that time frame like?
So this is a very good question, and there's actually a good answer to it, because the pick list is longer already, right? As if you go into the feedstock CI calculator tool, the pick list is already in, again, what I mentioned, you already have manure in there, you got green ammonia in there. Okay, it's not that much produced yet, right? But again, the fertilizer is much, there's many more options within the fertilizer, right? Tabs, again, there's NSERF, nitrification inhibitors split out separately from 4R, right, already. So the pick list is already there. That's the good news, right? We just have to use that pick list and say, hey, you got to give pick list for now, and let that be a more comprehensive pick list of 6 practices that are in there. And then I don't think I know it's not that difficult to add other practices, right? We could, if it worked, we could add microbial fertilizers. We could add, there's other practices that are being done, right? And it wouldn't be, I think that would be, I mean, certainly the Argonne Greek group would be very open if we provide data to it. I mean, I don't work for Argonne. I have a subcontract for Argonne, but I don't, I can't speak for Argonne, but I do think they would be very open to doing that. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever seen that? Is there ever an ILUC number that's negative? Because Ron Appleson came in here a few years ago and told us that, a lot of modern farm practices can put more organic carbon in the soil than was there before we started farming. And so all these new practices that are making the soil better, I agree with you, you shouldn't counter, it should be accurate. I can see where burning down the rainforest and then planting crops is a bad kind of land use change. But if it's a prairie or it's a farm using it for pasture or cut hay and decides to plant corn, I don't see how that's a dramatic change for negative.
Yeah, so the way to do this negative, I want to go back to, can I go back here? There are actually negative ILUC. Hold on, did I already go past? There are negative ILUC values. I don't know if I have one in there. I don't. So there are negative ILUC values. So here, for example, you see tallow, used cooking oil, etc. They have an ILUC value of 0, right? So that's waste products that are converted into fuel, right? So if you take used cooking oil, there's no ILUC associated with that. Another where it can have really negative ILUCs, and even under CORSIA, that's much bigger tables under CORSIA, would be, for example, a cover crop that you harvest, for lipids, right? And you produce biodiesel or renewable diesel, like let's say a winter canola or carinata, these sort of boutique cover crops. And then you produce a fuel, right, from lipids, and then you produce a meal in addition. And that meal, similar to the corn ethanol pathway, would also give you a co-product credit and would drive, therefore, the ILUC negative. So you can have a negative ILUC from that. And then you could also have significant sequestrations from a crop, like a miscanthus, in theory, has, sequesters a lot of carbon in the soil. But they're not the kind of feedstock that gives you a lot of volumes, right? The big volumes will come from corn, soy. These are sort of boutique cover crops, and yes, they're negative, and yes, they'll be highly sought after, especially under CORSIA, because they have an established negative ILUC default value, right? But that's how you could get a negative ILUC. You could get for corn, soy, and I had it shown a couple times, you can get quite close to carbon neutral, let's say for corn, if you implement all those practices. If you, for example, were to plant corn on corn and you're able to squeeze a cover crop in, and so that's ways you can get to very, very close to carbon neutral corn. Yeah.
Does Argonne take into account direct land exchange risks for making electric vehicles, like getting all the vehicles from Indonesia and burning down all the streets?
Yeah, I think there are those studies are out there, in the battery, in the battery module of grid. And I don't know how to address it. So I mean, the ILUC, it turns out that evidently you don't need that much area, produce the cobalt. I think the working conditions are horrendous there, and the pollution is horrendous there, right? And I think there's probably some additional work, that can be done. It's a little bit similar to the land use impact, let's say, of a solar farm, right? Which, it's hard to the solar farm is quite efficient in producing energy, right? So you produce more megajoule than in agriculture. But then again, an agricultural field, you can much easier, that produces biofuels, reintroduce back into producing feed and fuel, right? By already producing feed, so into food production, right? Versus you have to take a solar farm down, right? You have to retill it, and you have all kinds of issues associated with that, right? So yes, there is an opening, I feel like, to further inform that science. I was part of an unrelated Argonne project where I did point that out in a 2 or 3 page writing, but it is worth revisiting. Yeah. Is that what?
How does Argonne take into account? Is it just assume it's a single value, or do they have a range?
Yeah, I gotta send you that report. So basically what they're doing is, to my knowledge, ILUC is not taken into account for, rare earth mining and things like that. But they're obviously taking into account all the energy intensity and everything. But I think we all know, we all see the picture from the Congo, how it is actually mined, and the conditions, how it's actually mined. So there might be some more work to do. Good.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mueller.
All right. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Bushmacher. He is a partner at Boyd and Gray. He represents public and private companies, trade associations, nonprofits, and individuals, both as an advisor and advocate with a particular focus on energy and environmental matters. Before joining the firm, Mr. Bushmacher served at the U.S. Department of Justice as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division. There he led senior department leadership, served as the lead attorney on several lawsuits, and helped draft policy memoranda for the department on the proper scope and procedure for environmental enforcement. He also helped lead the team that secured the second largest Clean Air Act settlement in U.S. history. And prior to serving in the government, Mr. Bushmacher was an associate in the DC office of Sidley Austin. Welcome, Michael Bushmacher.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. That settlement was against Mercedes, but I don't think they're here, so. Yeah, diesel defeat device, delightful times. So I'm going to talk about the litigation that's ongoing, mostly in the DC circuit. I've just, on the slides I've just covered the main stuff that's kind of been briefed and argued, but I can talk about the rest of the cases, many of which have been filed quite recently at the end if we've got some time, and I'll try to leave some time for questions. So the electrification promise, I love that photo. Don't ask about the carbon intensity of that machine. Was to use fuel economy standards to drive 100% electrification. That was the promise that Biden made when he was candidate Biden. There's one big problem with that, which is that you can't do that if you're NHTSA. There's the statute you already heard from Jimmy about the restrictions that the Energy Policy and Conservation Act puts on NHTSA may not consider the fuel economy of dedicated automobiles, which of course, because it's a statute, is defined, and it's defined as automobiles that operate only on alternative fuel, and that is defined, and alternative fuels include electricity. So there's no other law that says, hey, you federal agency get to decide how much electric vehicle penetration is right for the market and our climate goals or anything like that. So that's where this reverse engineering, I think Mike Hartrick did a good job of explaining it as sort of shimmying sideways towards electrification. Another way of thinking about it is reverse engineering it. They realized that they had misspoken in those early promises, and so they shifted, and they being the Biden administration, they shifted to what they've called a whole of government approach, and that is the solution when Congress doesn't give you authority to do something, and there are some laws that say you agency can't do this, you have to. I'd like to think of it as like smurfing. If you're going to commit financial fraud, don't just put it in one big transaction. You got to do a bunch of little ones, right? And regulatory smurfing. Okay, so I'm a litigator and I represent people in suits against all this. I have a view. It's just how I'm going to be today. And there is a federal court that actually used that terminology to describe the whole of government approach in regulation. And so the three building blocks that Jimmy talked about are the kind of three main pillars of it. Jimmy doesn't like pillars because it suggests that if you knock one down, the whole house will fall. Not true. The idea was having multiple belt suspenders and maybe two belts. And that centers around these three building blocks or prongs or pillars. One, EPA's tailpipe emission standards. Two, NHTSA's fuel economy standard. Three, the CARB EV mandates. The first is the EPA rule, and there was, in addition to the rule that's just been promulgated, there was a rule at the very end, December 30th of 2021, that did this reverse engineering thing for the first time, and that rule, here you can see on 86th volume of the Federal Register on page 74,438. EPA said we're going to drive up electrification from 7%, where they thought things would go if they didn't do a new rule, up to 17%. The way this works, the mechanics of it is through averaging, right? You set standards not for individual vehicles or vehicle types, but for the whole set of vehicles that weigh a certain amount or have a certain size. Regardless of whether those vehicles actually emit the relevant pollutant. One of the questions in the litigation that's ongoing is, well, can you do that? Is that a legitimate reading of the statute, which says that EPA regulates classes of vehicles that emit pollution? So that case is called Texas versus EPA. The main arguments there are one, the major questions doctrine, and for those of you who aren't, legal nerds following this stuff, major questions doctrine is basically a principle of ordinary language that the Supreme Court has taken to looking at expansive new regulations, saying if you have a plausible textual basis for this, but it's such a big deal that it seems very unusual that Congress would do it without saying so explicitly. Once it reaches that threshold of economic or political significance, we're not just going to require that the agency be able to have an arguable basis for what it wants to do. It needs a clear statement. So the argument here is that, well, that's a lot of money, 300 billion in estimated costs. And obviously EVs are a politically sensitive issue. That suggests that the Clean Air Act and the provisions of it that go to vehicle regulation, maybe those shouldn't be read that expansively without having Congress weigh in on it. The second point is what I kind of already mentioned about averaging, and this is an area where I think there has been disagreement between at least the biofuels folks that I represent and the autos about averaging. Of course, the autos, and you all who do this know that it's an important flexibility under the way things have been done historically. What's unique here or different here is that flexibility of averaging was used not as something to make compliance easier, but actually to take the tools of the Clean Air Act and to use them for this new purpose of driving electrification consistent with the president's promise and executive order. The third point is what I already mentioned about whether you actually have to have an emission of the relevant pollutant to belong to that class or classes of motor vehicles or engines. And then the last is there are some arguments that EPA made irrational decisions. I'll give you one example. They say that consumers are so irrational that they don't know how to value fuel economy savings when they buy vehicles. There's this so-called energy efficiency gap. And they say all of that energy efficiency gap it should go to us as a benefit from our rule. In other words, people are so dumb they don't take into account energy savings really at all. And in fact, they go on to say, EPA goes on to say that there are no trade-offs. It'd be very interesting to hear from any engineer who would be willing to defend that proposition. There are no trade-offs between fuel economy and performance. So towing capacity can go up, horsepower can go up, but it doesn't have any necessary impact on fuel economy. There's a free lunch apparently that we just weren't eating. The arguments against this, one, EPA's main argument is we've been doing standards for a long time. It doesn't say you have to have EVs. It just says you have to meet these numerical targets on average, and you have many different compliance pathways. The fact that we model changes in electrification doesn't mean it's really an electrification mandate. The counter argument to this, of course, is, well, maybe that's sometimes the case, but you guys actually said that this was designed to drive electrification. And the president said that he was giving you the job of setting new standards precisely to get to that promised goal of 50% and then eventually 100% electrification of the vehicle fleet. On the averaging point, again, that's something that the autos rely on because it is an important compliance flexibility. And it means that there's a sort of harmonization between how the NHTSA statute, which actually says do corporate average fuel economy, and the Clean Air Act. And since these two things are so closely related, it sure would be nice to have them working on basically the same kind of principles. In terms of the way in which they argue about the emission of the relevant pollutant, class can be all kinds of different things. And so the dispute there is really when Congress said class, did it mean and it's defined as size or weight of the vehicle, right? So it's what kind of size the vehicle is that matters. And the sort of textual way of thinking about this might be if you said the class was disruptive, talking about a schoolroom class, that doesn't mean that every single kid in the class was disruptive. It just means the class as a whole was disruptive. On the other side, the argument that we've made is that if you were to say something like the class of immunosuppressant drugs, you'd be very surprised to find drugs that aren't immunosuppressant in that class. So whether the Clean Air Act is like the second example or the first example is an issue in that litigation. There's also kind of a procedural issue in this case, which is that the comments didn't really spell out the averaging point as clearly as perhaps they should have. And so EPA has argued that that's simply not properly in front of the court. At the argument last September, the court really seemed to be concerned that it wasn't actually an EV mandate. One judge actually started talking about Subaru and was actually wrong, was saying that Subaru wasn't going to electrify under EPA's modeling. And of course, no one briefed it because that's not what the record actually said. But that took up at least half the oral argument that day, which was a little bit frustrating. But the way that that's going to develop is really uncertain. I don't think, giving my candid opinion, I would be surprised if the DC Circuit, which is where this is being litigated, rules in favor of the challengers. It will be interesting to see whether there's a dissent. There is a partisan difference in the judges on that case. There's one Trump-appointed judge, Judge Katsas, and one Obama-appointed judge, Judge Srinivasan, and one Biden-appointed judge, Judge Pan. So TBD, what's going to happen with that? Inside baseball for a minute is that neither Katsas nor Srinivasan is particularly fast. If you look at their stats about how long it takes them to get out opinions. So we've been waiting since September. I suspect we'll be waiting a little bit longer. So I'll skip over to California while we're waiting. I love these pictures. I mean, I hate them, but I think they're very illustrative of what CARB is up to. You get it. It's a fossil fuel station, right? It's fossilized. And to make the point even clearer, there's Mary Nichols cutting a fuel hose for the opening of the new CARB headquarters. The sort of unique position California occupies here, just a little hit, I'm sure most of you already know this, but it's a historical artifact from the challenges that California has with smog. Back in the 70s and 60s, there were vehicles were a large contributor to their smog problem in the LA basin. And California had already had its own program for a few years before the kind of initial version of the Clean Air Act was passed in 1967. And so it gives this procedure by which California can get permission. A waiver is what it's called, a waiver of preemption. So preemption is the point that when federal law controls something, state law can't control it at the same time. So the federal law preempts or displaces or puts aside the state law. And that's how the Clean Air Act works for vehicle regulation. But the one exception is that California, if it shows that it needs the standards it's gotten to meet extraordinary and compelling needs in the state, EPA can grant it a waiver. There are a few more conditions. You can read them there if you're really curious. Now, of course, cars are much cleaner than they used to be. If you look at some interesting data there about smog changes in California over the years. So most of the problems with smog in California, which do persist, but most of those are not attributable to vehicles in the way that they were. It has to do with things coming over from China or the forest fires because they're bad forest management or whatever. And so unsurprisingly, having fixed one problem, CARB has focused on climate instead. It's a little history of kind of the different regulatory efforts that CARB has put out. The main one that was at the beginning of the Biden administration was a restoration of a waiver for the electric vehicle mandate in the program called Advanced Clean Cars 1. And that gets up to a nominal 22% EV mandate. It's actually a little lower because of the way the credits and things work. But by model year 2025. And so this was one of these lovely regulatory back and forth games. The the Obama administration granted a waiver, the Trump administration rescinded the waiver, and then the Biden administration came and rescinded the rescission. And so we flipped and we flopped and we flipped again. And the arguments there are a little bit more cabin than they are if you were to have a waiver challenge from the very beginning, because basically the petitioners challenging that have to defend the Trump administration rescission on the grounds that gave. So the key arguments, again, major questions doctrine, the idea that EPA's waiver authority contains some kind of tacit authority to let states mandate electrification seems a little implausible. And given the importance of it and the economic significance, you're going to expect a clear statement, or at least that's the argument. The second argument, and major questions is a statutory argument. It's about the standard that you have to meet. So it's not really a separate point. It's all tied together. The second point is that California doesn't need it because actually it won't change greenhouse gas emissions at all. That was a finding of the Trump administration that Biden EPA did not reverse, didn't say really anything about, which is that it doesn't do anything for the climate. And so how could you need something that doesn't do anything? And then the other argument, of course, is that, well, whatever is the case about climate change generally, California doesn't have some sort of special, unique injury from that. And that is the most natural reading of those words, compelling and extraordinary conditions. Another argument that's there is that EV mandates are related to fuel economy because they're all about reducing, to go back to those pictures of CARB, they're about reducing the amount of fuel consumed per vehicle mile traveled across the fleet. And there's a statute, Energy Policy and Conservation Act, that says states cannot do any kind of regulatory thing that is related to fuel economy. So that provision, unlike the Clean Air Act, doesn't have one of these waiver things. So NHTSA can't come in and say, hey, California, you can do this. And then the last point, a very interesting point, is that the unequal treatment that California gets here, at least as applied to the climate context, violates the principles of equal sovereignty. The idea of equal sovereignty is that when the states came in the union, they're all equal to one another. One is not bigger or more important as a matter of sovereignty than any other state. And so Ohio said, no one comes to us and asks, can we get into some sort of agreement about what kind of car policy we're going to have for the next 10 years? No one, we are injured by this. And so the DC Circuit ruled against the petitioners, ruled against all of them. For most of them, all the private petitioners, they said, well, you haven't really shown that this EV mandate is actually going to mandate any EVs. I know, implausible. At least that's how I feel about it. And so they said that they lacked standing, that they hadn't shown that any injury they suffered would be redressable by a court order. It's a fairly limited holding designed, I think, for kind of a this day only sort of thing, where the court said, because there's only a few years left in this program, it ends in model year 2025, or at least California amended the EV mandate to end in 2025. Therefore, it's just, there's not enough time. Automakers can't change. Now, there were comments from Toyota in the record that said we would change. That didn't matter. Thank you for those comments. Those were very good. And then on this equal sovereignty point, the court said, well, you do have an injury. At least you've done enough to get into court with it. But we don't agree with your argument that California here is getting unequal treatment in a way that offends this constitutional background principle. The court didn't really, it refused to look at whether a more narrow, when it comes to climate, that is too much, and said that was waived. Kind of a strange thing to say. They said, you didn't raise this in your opening brief. There's a 3-page section on it in their opening brief. I don't know, maybe they missed it. So the next stop is going to be the Supreme Court, which will be a challenge to basically all of these things, the standing and the substance. The counter arguments, since I'm trying to be at least somewhat fair here, major questions, the argument would be that applies to regulations, not to these kind of waivers of preemption. That's not the right way of looking at it. California obviously has climate impacts, and therefore, just because it's not going to fix it, that's not reason enough to say you can't do it. They also say that if you want to challenge this EPCA violation, instead of coming to court and saying, hey, EPA, you got it wrong, you should just be going to district court. Now, we did go to district court, and then the court there stayed us and said, you got to wait for EPA. This has been a frustrating journey in some respects. But the last point, is that if Congress wants to set up different things for differently situated states, it's free to do so. It's limited by the express delegations of authority in the Constitution, and this background principle shouldn't be used to handcuff Congress when it comes to making laws that do good things. So first shall be last. NHTSA's largely become irrelevant because of that restriction, with a couple of caveats, which I'll get to. So EPCA, again, this is the actual affirmative part of the EPCA statute. Says, you, DOT, NHTSA, you prescribe maximum feasible average fuel economy standards. Also, EPCA, you may not consider fuel economy of EVs, among other things, when you're doing that. So there's been a weird dance. I think we already got that awesome picture of Justice Stevens, where NHTSA and EPA are regulating the same thing at the end of the day, fuel economy, carbon emissions, but they are doing it pursuant to different statutes and with different restrictions. And because EPA wanted to go further, or I should say the Biden administration wanted to go further, they, kind of like Gwyneth Paltrow, to go to the now column here, they consciously decoupled. They consciously decoupled the rulemakings, and so NHTSA, from being the lead agency on these things, has now been kind of the rump. It comes along at the end. It's still a very stringent rule. It drives up increases of 8% improvements for 24 and 25, and then 10 for 26. Again, it's not really possible to comply with that using just conventional vehicles, even hybrids. And what's remarkable about it is that they still considered EVs. They said, well, we are only going to exclude the consideration of EVs for the standard setting years. So that's going to, because there's this like complicated credit trading program that goes 5 years into the future, you can, just because something changes, just because something applies in 1 year doesn't mean you actually need to meet that target for that year. You can trade and come up with compliance strategies that let you jump the hoops sort of retroactively. So they said, it's going to drive up electrification, and we're going to consider electric vehicles for these non-standard setting years, but we think that's okay. And they also included in what they called the regulatory baseline, the ACC1 EV mandate. And I like to think of that as like a regulatory Horcrux, because I'm a millennial and that's the only book I've ever read. You remember the Horcrux from Harry Potter, right? The Voldemort puts his soul in some object so that if he gets killed, his soul survives and he can keep on doing bad things. It's a little bit like that, right? If you knock out ACC1, we're challenging ACC1, you knock that out, well, the stringency is baked in to the NHTSA standards. So it's still kind of there. It's ghost, so a good part of its spirit survives and has this kind of Voldemort second life. So all those things are issues that are in the litigation. Also about it being about electrification. There's Mayor Pete wearing very nice shoes for a construction site, and it accelerating the path to electric vehicles, unsurprisingly. So key arguments: one is the consideration, and two is this baking in point. So unlike the other two, EPA, which I said, Texas versus EPA, which I said, like, oral argument was not a pleasant experience. And then the Ohio versus EPA case, which has already been decided against the petitioners. This one, at least if you're going to read tea leaves, and very big caveat that who knows, but the argument went a lot better than might have been feared, at least if you were sitting in my seat. The court at one point said, one of the judges, Judge Srinivasan, said, it sounds like you're reading a statute that says you may not, as if it said you may if. And then he also said, just to the government's lawyer, could you just walk me through syllable by syllable where it is that you get the authority to do this in considering electric vehicles? And the government's lawyer said, well, let me take a step back. Well, that's not syllable by syllable. So, again, Srinivasan, Katsas, not particularly fast judges. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, but it's almost certain that this decision is going to come out after NHTSA finalizes its new standards, which are going to be done in just a few weeks. They've already been sent to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. The regulatories are at the White House. So what's next? Ultimately, it's got to go to one first street to the Supreme Court. And I think that, at least for California and EPA, is where the showdown will ultimately happen. A big caveat is if things change in November, maybe the litigation will go away, get resolved, get settled. But even if there is a second Trump administration, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these issues, at the very least, some of the California issues, do make it up to the Supreme Court in the fairly near future. In addition to the cases that I've walked through, which are kind of fully baked, there are a bunch of new cases. So there's a challenge to the new EPA tailpipe rule for light and medium duty vehicles. It was brought by 26 states, led by Kentucky. There's a second one led by Nebraska challenging the heavy duty rule. I very much expect that the same petitioners that you saw in those first round of cases will show up for the second round, and probably a lot more folks. Then you have you've got the NHTSA stuff, which is going to come down. That will get challenged almost certainly. There's also a challenge to one part of the new EPA tailpipe rule. They glommed onto it a determination on the R factor, how much you discount fuel economy based on changes to the energy density of the fuel. That's a challenge being, we are counsel in that, representing Texas corn, Texas sorghum, and national sorghum, saying that that part of it is wrong. That part is not promulgated under the Clean Air Act, so it's not, in our view, subject to the mandatory DC Circuit jurisdiction for Clean Air Act emissions challenges. So that one we actually brought in the Fifth Circuit. It's gonna be interesting to see what happens with that. There's the PEF challenge. We already heard of PEF, the petroleum equivalency factor. That's been challenged in the Eighth Circuit by, I think, 14 states. And then we represent the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce there. And so that one is rolling right. That one's actually on a pretty fast schedule. The opening brief is due, I think, 9 days from now. So we're going to see over the summer, as all these things come down, more challenges get filed. But I think the basic, aside from some of the technical things like the PEF, the basic outlines are the things that have already been framed in those first 3 DC Circuit cases. Can EPA reverse engineer EV mandates? Can NHTSA consider electric vehicles? And can California be a climate regulator for vehicles? I think, it's going to be, regardless of what happens with political change, if the courts do finally weigh in on those things on the substance, that's going to change for, the foreseeable future, the conversation around how motor vehicle regulation happens in the US, and more broadly, what climate policy and statutory interpretation and the regulatory state look like. So with that, happy to take any questions.
I've got the mic. Anybody have a question? Not seen any mic.
Very
Covered a lot of
comprehensive.
ground with a lot of good slides.
I'm literally standing between you and ethanol. So
Yeah.
like,
Okay, I can put the mic down. Just the NHTSA thing of the statute you showed up there that says they can't consider dedicated fuel vehicles in fuel economy. I mean, they knew that was there.
they did. Yeah, it's a tough argument to make if you're them. They tried to have as narrow a reading as they could of it and say basically the statute doesn't make any sense if we have to blind ourselves to reality. Electric vehicles are part of the world. We shouldn't be mandating them, but we should be able to take cognizance of the fact that this exists. Otherwise, our standards are completely meaningless. They do nothing in the real world. That is the argument that they made. And, you can see their point. That it would make, that's why they're last, right? If they used to be the lead, they used to be the only one that did this stuff. And now they're kind of also regulated. Now, I think that just shows that there are flaws on the rest of it. And not that NHTSA should abandon its statutory restrictions. But the whole point they make is we're just looking at reality.
If you look at some of the older NHTSA rules, they're very clear that what they're doing now is not allowed.
Yes, there's a whole string of them.
Okay. And
they're cited in our brief.
And, they're allowed to change their mind, but they have to explain it. And I don't know. Well, I'll let Michael tell you how good they explained it.
What was that?
If they're allowed to change their mind, but they have to explain it.
They do.
After a fashion.
Well, one interesting thing that they did recognize they changed their mind on was the EPCA preemption of the California standards. And they said, we don't know. They went from saying this is illegal, it's preempted by EPCA. And then they said, we don't know. And then in this rule, they said, these are real legal obligations that states are free to enforce, but also we're not sure if they're legal. We said that explanation is incoherent and inconsistent. Of course, you made up your mind. You treated them as legal. You can't say that you didn't if you say that they're lawful, right? Pick one. If they don't want to pick one, understandably, but that argument also, and that was actually so we represent petitioner interveners in that case, and that was what we did, what we presented at the oral argument in September. I don't think that's how the court's going to rule on that case. I think the consideration point is easier for the court, but it struck me as a very strange switcheroo.
There's other howlers in there about, I think they estimate that they have 0.000 degrees change in temperature. We could go on.
Yeah, yes, and that is, they say something very similar in the new proposed rule. They said that, among other things, net benefits for consumers of passenger vehicles are going to be negative. Maybe you shouldn't do it then. Like, if you're admitting that you're making the world a worse place, that's a remarkable thing for an agency to say. But they do say that it will make a 0.000 degree change in global temperatures. Their spreadsheet just ran out of decimals. Need more decimal places in it so that they can quantify the benefits. Yeah, that's right. Well, one remarkable thing that we haven't really talked about is the climate benefits calculations. So EPA, in its original proposal for this next time around, their proposal said some 380 billion in projected benefits. Then they looked at the comments, I guess, and the comments said, yeah, your cost estimates are way low. It's much more expensive. And so they took their cost from 300 billion or something like that up to over 800. But of course, now they want to make it seem like, well, it's cost benefit justified. So they used a new climate model, one that no one had ever commented on. And all of a sudden, the benefits, the climate benefits that EPA projected from its rule went from 380 billion to 1.3 trillion. That lever is very powerful. And it's, why not set it at infinity?
Hi, Michael. So kind of in the theme with our consumer guest for tomorrow, you all have to deal with this too. I mean, in the normal world, outside of our world, nobody is obviously following as much as you. No consumer really could begin to even talk about EPA, CARB, let alone the letters of all the things that we talk about. So how, I guess twofold. One, so if administration things change in the fall, how does that affect what the litigation pieces are? And I'm sure you'll know, I mean, the timelines, or if it goes in the direction of the petitioners of something that we want and something changes, what happens then? And then on the consumer, is there any opportunity to, this goes back to Ernie's point earlier about communications and how we can explain this to the everyday person to get behind something, right? Of maybe not wanting to buy electric vehicle. Maybe they do, maybe they want a hybrid. I don't know. But if there's an opportunity for us to focus for this time period on how to reinforce some of the things that we're working on the liquid fuel space. Yeah. And then just what happens with these litigations is my two questions.
I'll take those in reverse order. So on communications, I mean, it's the complexity, if you're a cynic like me, the complexity is designed to obscure the costs. Right? If you really want to improve fuel economy, you'd just put a bigger gas tax on things, right? And so it would be that'd create an incentive, but that cost is visible. Everyone sees it on the side of the road. So hiding costs has been a regulatory tactic for a long time, and the whole of government approach squares that or cubes it by making all these different agencies. So every agency says, well, it's not us. Look at the other ones. They all do this when they get challenged. But the story is very simple. They want to make things very expensive to pursue a climate dream that isn't going to be effective and that mandates consumer choice for things you don't want. And it's no accident that when EPA came out with the new rules, the way they defended them at the big launch event was to talk about consumer choice. And I suppose there is a consumer choice in it. You can have a Ford Model T in any color as long as it's black kind of way. But I think that's the issue. It's driving up costs, and it's eliminating choice, and it's making things that don't work for a lot of people, right? No one wants to rent an electric car because what if you have to drive someplace where there's not charging infrastructure, or if you're not used to it? Like those sort of things, normal people experience that and they don't like it. So it's just about pretty basic education. I don't think there's a complexity to it. I think it's government overreach and it's eliminating choice. On the litigation, there are a couple different routes the Trump administration could go. They could stay the cases and then do a new rule. They could enter into some kind of settlement, and that settlement could have some kind of agreement about where things need to go, or they could continue litigating them and see what happens. I don't know which is going to be the most attractive to a Trump administration, in part because settlement has a lot of benefits, but everyone's heard sue and settle, right? That there would be a real vulnerability that could be attacked, and that you could throw a wrench in that through one way or the other. Now, I will say the Biden administration got away with a lot of sue and settle at the beginning when it wanted to get rid of regs that it didn't like. So that's the fastest, but maybe the most risky in terms of procedurally. Litigating it is, of course, not going to be popular in the sense that they'd be defending rules they don't believe in. But there'd be a potential benefit to having something resolved more by a court, by the Supreme Court, especially if it gets up to there at that point. So the transition and the transition strategy about how they approach this and how savvy they are is a big unknown. And I think we're only, there are things I think folks can be doing to educate the transition team as that kind of comes into being. But there are different options, none of which is like a clear, this is the right way of doing it.
So in follow-up, she asked if there's administration change. I guess my question is, and if there is not administration change, is there still hope for litigating some of these things and putting some limits on government overreach?
Yeah, there's hope. I mean, these are not super, I don't view really any of these as super complicated, like statutory interpretation or like constitutional things. It's really just, does the court have the political will to stand up and say, this is actually what the law says? And if they do, then most or all of this gets stopped. Now, there are things that you could try to do in response to that. I don't think you're ever going to completely end the attempts of progressive administrations and blue states to push these kind of things, but it would significantly curtail it. And if popular opinion is any suggestion here, I've seen some polling data on it that's very favorable to our side on this. People don't want it, and ultimately, if you have that, you can do almost anything with popular opinion.
That's somewhat of a follow-up, sort of following the same train. And I'm trying not to go too far down a hypothetical here, but assuming a victory here, it would probably, at least in some of these cases, it'd be remanded to EPA. And so I guess what's the hope in the resolution that they're going back in basically a narrower world and have to adhere to however the court ruled?
Yes, it's that you have an opinion that says you can't do, like, NHTSA is an easy example. NHTSA, no, you actually just can't consider EVs. Period. When you're setting standards, it's compliance flexibility. It's not something you get to consider on the front end. Well, then, that would be pretty hard for an agency to write around. I mean, you can try things. There's a million different ways you can bend this or that calculation or preference, but that would be a real restriction on that. If it's something that's like a really vague ruling that leaves a lot of wiggle room, that's a different story. And so a lot just depends on how the court writes it and how aggressive the administration wants to be in pushing back on it. So I'll give an example of where they've been very aggressive is in the power plant sector, right? West Virginia versus EPA case I mentioned before is a clean power plan case. And the court said that you can't do this. You can't transform the electric generation sector this way. can't set standards no one can comply with and all this stuff. And what EPA did on remand is it worked very hard to come up with something that does way more, actually goes even further. Now, that's a big, it's a bold strategy, Cotton, see if it pays, there's all that. If it goes up to the Supreme Court and the DC Circuit just denied a stay in that case, and they will be taking it up to the Supreme Court, I guarantee you. And when they do, if the court takes it, they're going to get their jaw, they're going to get their teeth knocked in, and it's going to significantly curtail their authority. One of my colleagues likes to call this the abuse it, lose it approach. And it is one of the few ways in which agencies do have some skin in the game. If you push something aggressive, you may find out, if you're an agency, that you had less authority than you thought you did for a very long time. So the example here would be, one example would be, maybe EPA can't do averaging, right? Maybe this authority they've been acting like they have since the 80s, maybe that doesn't exist. And then they're much more constrained in what they can do. So there's, it really depends on how it's written and where the court ends up taking it, but it could go a lot of different ways.
Slide presentation. There's a lot going on.
Yes.
And having lived through a bit of it over the last decade, I would just say that when it comes to whether the kind of rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, if NHTSA has authority to regulate electric vehicles, that's something I see that could end up being decided by the courts. But it feels like with basic standards themselves, the administrative changes to the standards are outpacing whatever court pace there is. And it feels like the fix is always in the executive branch, not the judicial branch. Just an observation, having lived through that for the last decade or so.
Yeah, like we're talking about the new next round of rules, and we still don't have conclusive answers on those first round. That's crazy to me. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, the question for the courts, a bigger picture question is, as the pace of regulatory change and this kind of, if you're an automaker or in any industry and you look at, here's a regulation that's coming down the pike, before it even is finalized, you're looking and planning to how to comply with it. After it's finalized, you're going to act, you're going to be, doing everything you can to comply with it insofar as you're able, because the consequences, if they win those cases, are pretty serious. And so it means that a lot of change gets driven without actually, we know this is the real rule and this is how you have to act. And I don't think administrative law has really appreciated that reality. And I think it's a serious thing that the courts will have to consider if they want to continue being relevant, is it's not just about doctrine or taking a big blockbuster case after a few years of it, kicking around the lower courts. You're going to have to move more quickly. What is interesting about that is the Supreme Court recently signaled, there's a very interesting concurring opinion from Justice Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Barrett, that emphasized the importance of the emergency docket. Now, if you're me and you're in this situation, not having any automakers who want to come along and challenge these things is very unfortunate, because it makes those sort of arguments much harder to the court to say we need emergency relief, because, you're domino number 10 down the line, and really it's only dominoes 1 and 2 maybe who can go in and say we can get emergency relief. But that is one kind of way in which the law has been adapting to that reality. But I don't think it's come far enough for the courts actually to have a meaningful say in these kind of things.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the speakers today. I think that'll close out today's session. We have a reception upstairs in the Vespucci room. Is that the correct? Oh, it's the flight deck. I'm sorry. Okay, flight deck. And tomorrow morning, there's a breakfast that starts around 7, and our agenda will start at 8 o'clock, and we have a pretty full schedule. So we'll see you tomorrow, or we'll see you over in the flight deck, and see you tomorrow morning.